Alright, welcome to the Learning College. Here we are continuing with For My Legionaries by Codreanu. And this chapter is titled The Student Movement. It's a very short chapter. I think it's only like 2 pages long. It was strange, but I'll read it. So this is titled December 10th, 1922, nearly 100 years ago. I was still in Jena when one day I was surprised by the news that the entire Romanian student body from all universities arose to battle. This collective demonstration of the Romanian youth, unsuspected by anybody, was a volcanic eruption rising from the nation's depths. It first manifested itself in Cluj, spelled C-L-U-J, the heart of the Transylvania, which took a stand any time the nation experienced an impasse. Then almost concomitantly, it violently erupted in all other university centers. In fact, on December 3rd and 4th, great street demonstrations took place in Bucharest, Iași, and Cernăuți. The entire Romanian student body rose to its feet as in a time of great peril. For the 1000th time, this earthly race, menaced so many times throughout history, threw its youth to face the threat in order to save its being. A great collective, electrifying moment with no preparation beforehand, without any pro and con discussions, without any committee decisions, without those in Cluj even knowing those in Iași, Cernăuți, or Bucharest. A great moment of collective enlightenment, like the lightning in the middle of a dark night, in which the entire youth of the country recognized its own destiny, and life as well as that of its people. This destiny runs brightly through our entire national history, and it extends into our whole Romanian future, pointing the way to life and honor both we and our grandchildren will have to follow, if it is life and honor we wish for our people. Generations can follow this destiny, can stay close to it or depart from it, having thus the capability of giving to their nation a maximum life of honor or a maximum of dishonor and shame. Sometimes only isolated individuals, abandoned by their generation, can reach this destiny. In that moment, they are the people. They speak in its name. All the millions of dead and of the martyrs of the past are with them, as well as the nation's life of tomorrow. Here, the majority with its opinions does not matter, though it might be 99%. It is not the opinions of the majority that determine this destiny of life for our people. They, the majorities, can only get nearer or farther away from it according to their state of consciousness and virtue, or that of unconsciousness and decadence. Our people have not survived through the millions of slaves who put their necks under the foreigner's yoke, but through Horia, Ivram Encu, Tudor, Iancu Giano, through all the Haidusi, which means Robin Hood-type legendary men, who, faced by the alien yoke, did not submit, but put their muzzle loaders on their backs heading up the mountain paths, carrying with them honor and the spark of freedom. It was through them our people spoke, not through cowardly and well-behaved majorities. They would conquer or die, no matter what, for when they die, the whole people lives from their dead and is honored by their honor. They shine in history like golden beacons on the heights bathed at sundown in the sun's rays, while over the vast lowlands, no matter how extensive and numerous, settles the darkness of forgetfulness and death. It is not he who lives and wins by sacrificing the destiny of his people's lives who belongs to national history, but only he who, whether he wins or loses, will hold himself to this destiny. Our Romanian destiny is predetermined by God's wisdom. It could be seen on December 10th by the Romanian students, and it is in this that the value of the day resides. The entire Romanian youth saw the light. On December 10th, delegates from all student centers congregated in Bucharest, fixed in 10 points what they thought formed the essence of their movement, and declared a general strike for all universities, demanding the realization of these points. December 10th is not great, though. December 10th is not great through the value of the formulation of points agreed upon, as much as delegates could formulate of the truth's essence that then troubled the entire Romanian youth. It is great by virtue of the miracle of this youth's awakening to the light its soul had seen, by its decision for common action to declare the holy war that was to demand of this youth so much strength of the heart, so much heroism, so much maturity, so much known and unknown sacrifices, so many graves. December 10, 1922, called the youth of this land to a great test. Neither those in Bucharest, nor I, who was far away, nor others who were perhaps high school students, but who today languish in so many prisons or sleep under the earth, could believe that this day would carry us through so much danger, would bring us so many blows and so many wounds and battles to defend our country. In Bucharest, Cluj, Iasi, and Cernaudi, formidable eruptions of student masses took place, which, led by their power of intuition, not by leaders, turned toward the enemy. They eye first the Jewish press, and he's talking about these specific publications titled The Truth, The Morning, The Redemption, The Opinion, The World, calling them hotbeds of moral infection, poison, and confusion for the Romanians. They turned to these in order to destroy them, but also to show the Romanian people the danger of the enemy's front line, which they must be on guard. Demonstrating against the press means declaring it an enemy of national interest and thus calling it to be the attention of Romanians that they not permit themselves to be fooled, blinded, or led by the press written by Jews or Judaized Romanians. This press attacks the religious idea, thus weakening Romanian moral resistance and breaking their contact with God. The press disseminates anti-national theories, weakening faith in their nation and breaking them from their country's land, of their love for it, land that was at all past times an urge to battle and sacrifice. This press falsely presents our Romanian interests, disorienting and directing Romanians on paths opposed to national interests. This press elevates mediocre elements and men capable of corruption so that the alien can satisfy his interests and downgrades the moral people who will not stoop to do Judaism and its interest any favors. The press poisons the soul of the nation, daily and systematically publicizing sensational crimes, immoral affairs, abortions, adventures. That is why Romanians must be careful when they read a Jewish paper, it being on guard against each word, not one of which is haphazardly printed, and seeking to decipher the Jewish plan behind it. It is these matters the student movement wanted to call to the attention of all Romanians when it turned on Jewish editorial officers, declaring them enemies of the Romanian people. I emphasized that the formidable eruptions of the student masses were led by their power of intuition and not by leaders, for it is easy for someone to direct several individuals towards somebody's house to stage a hostile demonstration. But when great multitudes turn on someone with hostility by order of their instinct, then that person is condemned, with no right of appeal, as an enemy of the nation. The formula, quote, numerus clausus, unquote, passes from mouth to mouth during student battles, but not as a saving formula, for masses do not issue formulas, they point out threats. Numerus clausus means that the Jewish menace being in its great numbers, we can no longer support them either in schools, in commerce or industry, or in the independent professions. Quote, attention to their great number, unquote, is what numerus clausus means to say, for it surpasses our powers of national resistance, and if we do not take any measures, we die as a people. This is the whole value of this formula, or if you wish, as a saving measure. It has the value of an emergency formula, of necessary first aid, though totally inadequate to cure the illness. Numerus clausus, per se, means the limitation of Jews in schools, professions, etc. To what numbers this limitation? To the proportion between the number of all Jews in relation to that of Romanians within Romania. Namely, if there are, in Romania, 15 million Romanians and 3 million Jews, the proportion is 20%. According to the numerus clausus formula, Jews are to be admitted into schools, medical professions, the bar, etc. in the proportion of 20%. Numerus clausus means limitation of number of Jews up to the proportion between their numbers and the total number of Romanians. Numerus clausus is only a formula of redistribution of the Jews within nations and not a formula for resolving the problem. This formula resolves almost nothing, for it treats of respecting proportions but does not cut down to high proportions of Jews. If the Jews are 3 million, that is what they remain. Especially, it does not treat the cause of this high proportion and does not show the means by which it can be diminished. In fine, it does not constitute of itself the means for resolving the Jewish problem. And that's the end of this very, very short chapter, and the next chapter that is awaiting is called The Jewish Problem, which is substantially longer, and I'm tempted to just combine this with that chapter. You know what? That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to just combine it with this next chapter. All right, since this was really short, we're just going to break this into the next chapter here. So this is the third chapter here, the Jewish problem, and the first section is titled The Number of Jews. The large number of Jews raises a series of problems. 1, the problem of the Romanian land. 2, the problem of the cities. 3, the problem of the Romanian school and of the leading class. 4, the problem of national culture. All these are impeccably treated by Professor A.C. Cuza in his writings The Peoplehood, Nationality and Art, Articles, Parliamentary Discourses, Horse and Political Economy. The ideas that I give below belong essentially to Professor Cuza's thought. The number of Jews in Romania is not known exactly. That is because the statistics were done with the greatest lack of interest on the part of Romanian politicians so that they could cover up their work of national treason, and because Jews everywhere run away from the truth of statistics. A proverb says, quote, "Jews live by lies and die when coming in contact with truth," unquote. As a matter of fact, for a long time, the director of the state statistics in the Ministry of Finance had been Leon Colescu, real name Leon Kohler. And from their point of view, they are right, because were Romanians faced with the exact number of the Jewish population, they would realize they are confronted by a real national menace and would rise up to defend their fatherland. In other words, in the face of statistical truth, the Judaic power flickers out, dies. It can live only by hiding truth, falsifying it by lies. We believe that there are from 2 to 2.5 million Jews in Romania. If there be but 1 million, as they claim, the Romanian people would face mortal danger, because it is not only the number per se that matters, the quantity, but also the quality of that number, particularly the positions occupied by Jews in the functional structure of the state and the life of the nation in all its aspects. Our land has been a land of invasions, but it has never throughout its long history known an invader to reach such formidable numbers as those of the present-day Jew. The invasions passed over us. The present-day invaders never leave. They settle down here on our land in more unheard-of numbers than ever before and hold on like scabies to this land's body and people. When did the Jewish invasion begin? Only several thousand Jews were found around 1800 in all of Moldavia. In 1821, there were 120 families in Bucharest. Such late settlement on our land is due to the fact that Jews have always engaged in commerce, and commerce demands freedom and security in which to develop. These two conditions were lacking in Romania. On one hand, the freedom to exploit Romanian soil, thus any prospect of extended commerce, and on the other, stability, security. Romanian land was the most unsecure land in the world. The Romanian peasant had no security of home, cattle, his labor, or his crops from year to year. Our country was ravaged by invasions and served as a theater of war for centuries, oftentimes with the aftermath of foreign domination and bloody tribute. What was Jewry to do on this land? Fight the Huns, Tartars, Turks? The Jewish invasion began only 100 years ago. As a result of the Peace of Adrianople in 1829, freedom of commerce was granted at the same time horizons of a more peaceful life began to appear. It was then that their invasion began, increasing year by year over our Romanian heads, especially those of the Moldavians, draining us of wealth, draining us morally, and threatening us with extinction. In 1848, the Moldovan merchants and industrialists began to complain to Mihail Sturza, the ruler, demanding measures be taken against Jewish merchants and dishonest competition practiced by them. Since then, the invasion has steadily increased. Invasion may not be the right term, for it presupposes the idea of violence, of moral and physical courage. Jewish infiltration is a more suitable term, for it better encompasses the idea of sly penetration, cowardly and perfidious penetration. For it is no small matter to steal the land and wealth of a people without justifying it through battle, through facing risks, through great sacrifice, the accomplished conquest. Little by little, they took over Romanian small commerce and industry. Then, by using the same fraudulent tactics, they attacked big commerce and big industry, thus acquiring control over the towns in the northern half of the country. The attack on the Romanian middle class was conducted with that precision met only in the case of some predatory insects, which, to paralyze the enemy, sting it in the spine. They could not have chosen a more suitable spot. Successfully attacking the middle class meant breaking down the Romanian people in two. It is the only class having a double contact, down, with the peasant class being superimposed on it and exercising over it authority by virtue of its better economic status and by education, up, with the governing class which it supports on its shoulders. The successful attack on the middle class, namely its destruction, brings in its wake as a fatal consequence no additional effort being needed on the part of the attacker. A, the collapse of the ruling class. It says in parentheses, this ruling class will end up collapsing. B, the impossibility of its reconstruction. No, possibility of its reconstitution. C, the confusion and animalization, the vanquishing and enslavement of the peasant class. In the last analysis, the jihadist attack on the Romanian middle class purports death. The death of the Romanian people does not mean the death of the last Romanian, as some imagine. This death means life in slavery, the lowering to slave life of several million Romanian peasants who would work for Jewry. Here are the findings of Professor Nicolae Iorga regarding the number of Jews and their arrival in our parts. Professor Iorga, in, quote, The History of the Jews in Our Principalities, unquote, a paper delivered before the Romanian Academy on September 13, 1913, exposing this question, specifies, among other things, quote, in Neamt, spelled N-E-A-M-T, several Jews settled on the lands of the monastery between 1764 and 1766. In Botosami, no ruler's document like that of 1757 mentions Jews among the other inhabitants of the town. Sometimes a Jew pops up in Suceava as a tavern keeper on church land, others as small merchants in Ocna, Harlu, Sirtiu, Galati, Barland. It says in parentheses, there was a time when one could say that Christian Barladians were engaged in commerce more than any other occupation. Then in Roman, where in 1741 only Moldavians and Armenians were known. In Targul Frumos, where in 1755 2 taverns and a Jewish one are mentioned as existing there, unquote. In Bukovina, about the time of its annexation in 1775, quote, in the regions of Cernaudi and Campulung, to which were annexed parts of Hotin and Suceava, in these regions before the Austrian imperial domination, there were only 206 Jewish families. In 1775, through overflow from Galicia, their numbers reached 780 to 800 families. The country's first governor, General Isenberg, learned that they engage primarily in tavern keeping with wine, whiskey, beer. They are, says the general, the most outright wicked people inclined to laziness, living without much trouble from the sweat of Christian working men, unquote. A commission operating in 1781 shows that, quote, in this country, Jews are in the habit of buying from the peasant the chick and the egg beforehand, the honey and the flour, the lamb in its mother's womb, for a pittance, and through this usury entirely sucking the inhabitants dry, bringing them to poverty so that the peasants thus burdened by indebtedness find no recourse for the future to save themselves, but by fleeing from the country. We see the administration of this country, Moldavia, then the boyars, particularly Constantin Moruzzi, desperately defending themselves against them. As the Kahals offered Ezrenberg in writing 5,000 pieces of gold annually to tolerate the old state of affairs, corrupting our ruler was also tried, but he rejected the money rather than expose his country to total destruction, unquote. And later, around 1840 to 1848, this is what Professor Iorga determines, quote, one could count these establishments of exploitation and deprivation by the score, tavern by tavern, with bottles of potato whiskey and other poisons all across Moldavia, exhausting a race for the feeding of the civilized vices of the domineering class. And Professor Iorga writes on, is continuing the previous quote, still, the intervention by foreigners fostered by Jewish elements in the country did not cease. In 1878, they imposed conditions before they would recognize Romania's independence, and heaped indignities on independent Romania, which cannot but commit suicide by politically yielding half of itself to the power of the Moldavian Jews. And as Cogal Nisianu defended villages from Jewish alcohol and usury, so Mr. Maiurescu defends Romania's dignity from the insult of granting civil rights to foreigners in the country as a result of the pressures of their co-religionists abroad, unquote. I cite these examples as reported by a great recognized and uncontested scientific authority to clarify the start of Jewish settlements on Romanian soil. Alright, now we're on the next section of this chapter titled The Problem of the Romanian Land. And this paragraph starts out saying, the law of the territory. There cannot be any people in this world, be they only a tribe of savages that, faced by a foreign invasion, would not consider with rending pain the predicament of its land. All peoples of the world, from history's beginning to this day, have defended the soil of their fatherland. The history of all peoples, as ours, is replete with battles in defense of its land. Would it be an anomaly, a state of illness of ours, the Romanian youth, that we stand to be counted in the defense of our menaced land, or an anomaly if we did not defend it when we see it endangered, or would it be an anomaly for us not to defend it, namely, not doing what all nations have done, placing us in contradiction to the entire world and our entire history? It would be an anomaly in a state of illness. Why is it, I wonder, that all peoples have fought, fight, and will always fight for the defense of their land? Land is a nation's basis for existence. The nation has its roots like those of a tree deep in the country's soil, whence it derives its nourishment and life. There is no people that can live without land, and there is no tree which can live hanging in the air. The nation which has no land of its own cannot live unless it settles on the land of another nation, on its very body, sapping its sustenance. There exist God-given laws which ordain the life of peoples. One of these laws is the Territorial law. God gave each people a definite territory to live in, grow in, and on which to develop and create its own culture. The Jewish problem in Romania, as elsewhere, consists of the infringement by Jews of this natural law of territory. They trespassed on our territory. They are the infractors, and it is not we, the Romanian people, who are called to bear the consequences of their infraction. Elementary logic tells us the infractor must bear the consequences of the committed infraction. Will he have to suffer? Let him suffer. All infractors suffer. No logic in the world will tell me that I should die for the infraction committed by others. Thus, the Jewish problem is not born of racial hatred, quote unquote. It is born of an infraction committed by Jews against the laws and natural order in which all peoples of the world live. The solution to the Jewish problem? Here it is. The re-entry of infractors into the universal natural order and the respecting natural legality. But the laws of the land, too, prohibit the Jewish invasion. Article 3 of the Constitution says, quote, the territory of Romania cannot be colonized by a population of foreign origin, unquote. What does the fact of the 2 million Jews settling on Romanian territory mean, if not colonization? But this territory is the inalienable and indefeasible property of the Romanian people. And as someone wrote, not after 50, not after 100, but even thousands of years later, we will claim the right over this land as we reconquer the Transylvanian land following 1,000 years of Hungarian occupation. And this is the next section of the chapter, We in Our Land. All peoples around us have come from somewhere else settling on the land on which they now live. History gives us precise dates regarding the arrival of Bulgarians, Turks, Magyars, etc. Only one people came from nowhere. Ours. We were born in the midst of time on this land together with the oaks and fir trees. We are bound to it not only by the bread and existence it furnishes us as we toil on it, but also by the bones of our ancestors who sleep in its ground. All our parents are here. All our memories, all our warlike glory, all our history here in this land lies buried. Here are the ruins of Sarmis Guetuza with the immortal King Disibel's ashes. For whoever knows how to die like Decibel, never dies. Here rest the ruling Musatins and the ruling Basarabs. Here at Podol and Alt, Razboni, Suava, Bayaya, Hotin, Soroka, Tihina, Seteta, Alba, Chilia, sleep the Romanian fallen there in battles, nobles and peasants as numerous as the leaves and blades of grass. At Posada, Caluengi, on the Alt, Giu and Serna rivers, at Turda, in the mountains of the unhappy and forgotten Moti of Vidra, all the way to Hudid and Alba Ulia, which says in parentheses the torture place of Foria and his brothers in arms. There are everywhere testimonies of battles and tombs of heroes. All over the Carpathians, from the Ultian mountains at the Dragoslave and at Predil, from Oitz to Vatra Dorni, on peaks and in valley bottoms, everywhere Romanian blood flowed like rivers. In the middle of the night, in difficult times for our people, we hear the call of the Romanian soil urging us to battle. I ask and I expect an answer. By what right do the Jews wish to take this land from us? On what historical argument do they base their pretensions, and particularly the audacity with which they defy us Romanians here in our own land? We are bound to this land by millions of tombs and millions of unseen threads that only our soul feels, and woe to those who shall try to snatch it from us. And here is the next part of the chapter titled, The Problem of the Cities. But within the breadth of this Romanian land, Jews did not settle just anywhere haphazardly. They placed themselves in towns, forming within them real islands of compact Jewish populations. At first, it was the cities and market towns of northern Moldavia that were invaded and conquered. Cernaudi, Hotin, Suceava, Dorhoi, Botosani, Soroka, Berdugeni, Icani, Ricini, Secureni, etc. Before them, the Romanian merchant and tradesman gradually disappeared. Today, one street, tomorrow, another. Day after tomorrow, a section. In less than 100 years, Romanian centers of ancient Rion lost their Romanian character, taking on the likeness of real Jewish fortresses. The other Moldavian towns, too, fell quickly. Roman, Piatra, Falticini, Baku, Vaslui, Barlad, Husi, Tesusi, Galati, and Iasi. The second capital of Moldavia, after the first one, in our ancient Suceava, was purely and simply turned into a dirty Jewish nest, which surrounds the poor glorious ruins of Stefan the Great's fortress. In Iasi now, one can walk through whole streets and sectors, never meeting a Romanian, or seeing a Romanian home, or a Romanian store. People pass by famous churches today in ruins and decay. The Church of Talapari, built by the Romanian Cobblers Guild, the Church of Culari, built by the Romanian Harness Makers Guild. Everything is falling apart. In that large city of Iasi, there is no longer a Romanian cobbler or harness maker. The Church of St. Nicholas the Poor of the old Moldavian nobility has totally collapsed, and over the tombs around it, the Jewish eating places discard even today their slop, garbage, and refuse. The church in the main square, where one finds the greatest agglomeration of people, is closed due to lack of churchgoers. And it is the Jewish population which constitutes the agglomeration of people now. On Lapusniau Street, Kuzavoda's palace, which almost groans as if in pain, has been transformed into a Jewish bank. And in its former garden, a Palestinian-style Jewish theater can be seen. The foreign invader tramples underfoot everything we hold most sacred. Our hearts groan in anguish. We children, our souls rent, ask ourselves, how could there be Romanians who behave with so much enmity toward their people? How could there be so many traitors? How come they were not lined up against the wall or burnt alive? in the moment of their betrayal? How come everybody's impassive? How come we do nothing? These are problems of conscience that weigh upon us, which bother our souls, upset our lives. We know that in no way will we find our peace but in battles, in suffering or in graves. Our silence covers us with cowardice, and every minute of delay seems to kill us. We do not even mention the cities and market towns of Bessarabia, which are open sores on the country's exhausted and squeezed body. Nor do we even mention Maramureș, where Romanians in a state of slavery daily die. There are no words that can describe the great tragedy of Maramureș. But the illness spread like a cancer. It reached Râmnicul Sărat, Buzău, Plăuți, and it penetrated the capital. In 15 years fell Vacaresti, an old Romanian quarter. Dudesti fell entirely. Likewise, the Romanian merchants on Calea Griviti. The famous merchants in the Uborsk quarter die and are replaced by Jews. Calea Victorii has fallen. And what this was is the Victory Way, which was a fashionable shopping boulevard. It says that in a little note here. Today has become in reality only a Romanian road of defeat, for 3/4 of the properties on Calea Victorii are now Jewish-owned. In the past 10 years, the Jews spread westward, up the Danube plain into Oltenia, and entered Michael the Brave's capital city of Craiovia. They went into Michael the Brave's capital city of Craiovia. They went into Ramni Valkia Severin under the protection of the Romanian politicians who, well paid, pretend there is no Jewish problem. This betrayal by these politicians of their people is so frightening that if they are still alive, the people should gouge their eyes out. If they are dead, their bones should be disinterred and burnt in public squares. Their children and grandchildren should be prosecuted, their wealth confiscated, and they should be stigmatized with the epithet of traitors' children. The loss of our Romanian towns has for us devastating consequences, for towns are the economic centers of a nation. The entire richness of the country is accumulated in them, so that whoever controls the towns controls the means of subsistence, the wealth of a nation. Could it be an indifferent matter to us Romanians as to who are the masters of our national wealth, ourselves or the Jews? To no people in the world could this be an indifferent matter, because a population reproduces and develops within the means of subsistence at its disposal. The fewer these means are, the less will be the growth of the population in question, and the fewer the chances for its development, and vice versa. These truths regarding the law of population were studied by all economics and formulated by Professor Cuza with unequaled clarity. The passing of Romanian riches into the hands of the Jews does not only mean the Romanians' economic dependence or the political one, for whoever has no economic freedom has no political freedom, but it means more, a national menace that grinds down our very ability to grow in population. To the extent that our means of subsistence vanish, to the extent we Romanians will die off on our land, leaving our places in the hands of the Jewish population, whose number increases day by day, both because of the invasion from abroad and because of seizing our means of subsistence, our riches. Then, secondly, the towns are the cultural centers of a nation. Here in towns one finds schools, libraries, theaters, lecture halls, all of them serving the townspeople. A Jewish family can easily support 5 or 6 children in school, whereas the Romanian peasant in some remote village far from town can hardly manage to send one child to school to the end. And in this case, he is completely exhausted of strength and wealth so that he endangers the well-being of the other 4 or 5 children at home. So whoever controls the towns controls the possibilities for partaking in the culture. But that is not all. It is through towns and schools that a nation fulfills its cultural mission in the world. How is it possible for the Romanians to fulfill their cultural mission through Jewish voices, pens, hearts, and minds? Finally, towns are the political centers of a nation. Nations follow the lead of the towns. Whoever controls the towns, directly or indirectly, has the political leadership of the country. What is left of the country outside of the towns? A crowd of several million peasants lacking humane means of existence, drained and impoverished, cultureless, poisoned by drink, led by the enriched Jews, now become the masters of Romanian towns, or by the Romanians, who are administrators in name only because they are nothing but supine executors of Jewish plans. These officials are supported, flattered, showered with gifts, co-opted in administrative councils, paid by the month by the Judaic economic power. It says here in parentheses, Judas was paid but once. Their lust for money is roused, but they are urged on to luxury and vice, and when disobeying Jewish directives and stances are purely and simply thrown out, even though they be cabinet ministers. Their pay and subsidies are cut, their thievery is brought to light, and shady business deals exposed, implicating them, in order to compromise them. This is what remains of the Romanian fatherland since we lost our towns, a dishonest leader class, a people of peasants without freedom, and all Romanian children countryless and futureless. Then it says here the problem of the Romanian school, which is the next section of this chapter. Whoever controls the towns controls the schools, and whoever controls the schools today controls the country tomorrow. Here are some 1920 statistics. The situation at the University of Sarnaudi. School of Philosophy. Summer semester. Romanians, 174 students. Jews, 574 students. School of Law, summer semester according to denomination. Orthodox Christians, 237. Catholics, 98. Lutherans, 26. Other religions, 31. Hebraic or Jewish, 506. From Situația Demografica a Romanii, which means the demographic situation of Romania, by M. Vasiliu Pluj, in Bessarabia, it says here, rural elementary schools. Boys, 72,889 are Romanians, 1,974 ethnically non-Romanian Christians, 1,281 Jews. Girls, 27,555 Romanians, 1,302 ethnically non-Romanian Christians, and 2,147 Jews. Urban elementary schools. Boys, 6,385 Romanians, 2,435 non-Romanians, of which 1,351 were Jews. Girls, 5,501 Romanians, 2,435 non-Romanians, of which 1,492 were Jews. Secondary and professional schools. 1,535 Orthodox Christians, 6,302 Hebraic. Coeducational secondary schools, 690 Orthodox Christian, 1,341 Hebraic. And this is basically hard to read this out because it's kind of like a chart that basically shows, like, in the Old Kingdom, in these schools, like in Lycée of Bacău, you'll have 362 Romanians, 198 Jews, and you'll have similar numbers in places where sometimes the Jews even outnumber the Romanians. But basically, and it gets even worse in some of these private schools as well. Same with the universities where medicine, pharmacy, law. Jews are just all over the place here. But you get the idea, and we don't need to delve into every single number here. You guys are good at detecting patterns, I would hope. The Romanian system of education, thus being destroyed by the large number of Jews, raises two problems. One, the problem of the Romanian leading class, because schools form the leaders of tomorrow, not only the political ones, but all leaders in every domain of activity. Two, the problem of national culture, because schools are the laboratory in which the culture of a people is molded. In order to underscore the tragedy of this Romanian school system overwhelmed by Jews, I consider it particularly important to cite below the distressing findings of one of the most illustrious pedagogues of our nation, Professor Ion Gavanescu of the University of Iasi. Quote, "We no longer wish to see the spectacle offered by the National Lycée of Iasi, where the crushing majority of students is composed of the Jewish element. The few Romanian students feel like strangers. During recess they retreat, uneasy, into corners. They constitute the tolerated minority. The majority lives apart, talk among themselves about their preoccupations, their games, societies, Maccabee, Hako, Mako, etc., of their get-togethers and lectures, their sports, work plans, and good times. And when they are doubtful of the discretion of the Romanians, the Jewish students whisper among themselves or switch directly to Yiddish. Quote, pity, and this is all a big quote, pity the Romanian professors faced with such students' souls. One involuntarily is reminded of the hen that hatched duck eggs. Look at her, how she stands cackling, scared at the edge of the pond, how she desperately calls her ducklings, her chicks of another species which jumped into the water, gliding off to the other shore where she cannot follow. What school of nationalism can you teach to such an audience? Can you talk if you feel yourself the flame of patriotism, the Romanian aspirations and ideals? Can you even open your mouth? Your jaws lock, your words freeze on your lips. The great Coganiciano, in the face of such benches full of foreign students, could he have pronounced his famous discourse introducing the history of Romanians, which he delivered on this very spot where today the Romanian National Lycée has turned into a Jewish national one? He would have lost the inspiration that derives its force from the sympathy of the shining eyes full of understanding and faith. And then we have another quote here from Gavin School, The Imperative to Historic Movement. And further, quote, and to limit ourselves to but one aspect of the national life, where did anyone ever see in England, France, Italy, a school at any level in which the preponderant number of students belongs to another people than the people constituting the indigenous population of the country and which founded the national state in question? Can anyone imagine, for instance, that some school of law in some English university, there might be 547 Jews versus 234 Britons, the same proportion of Jews to Romanians at the Cernaudi School of Law in 1920, or that at a school of philosophy in Italy there could be 574 Jews versus 174 Italians, the same proportion as that of Jews to Romanians in Cernaudi? Are these ratios normal? Are they not inadmissible, inconceivable monstrosities of ethnic biology? Are they not an indication of criminal unconsciousness on the part of the Romanian people's responsible leading class? Unquote. And now this leads to the next part of the chapter here, the problem of the Romanian leading class. But who are the pupils and students of today? The present-day students are the professors, doctors, engineers, lawyers, prefects, congressmen, cabinet ministers of tomorrow. In one word, the future leaders of the people in all domains of activity. If present-day students are 50, 60, 70% Jews, tomorrow we will logically have 50, 60, 70% Jewish leaders for this Romanian people. Can one still raise the question whether a nation has the right to limit the number of alien students in its universities? But here is how the question is answered in the Harvard University Bulletin by Morris Gray, a graduate of Harvard after he studied the Jewish problem there, as cited by Professor Kuza in Numerus Clausus, page 11. Morris Gray began by formulating the problem in principle, asking, quote, "First of all, what is the function of a university? What are its duties? If its duty is a duty to the individual, the admission into the university must be frankly and manifestly on the democratic principle. Any candidate must be admitted on the condition he pass his entrance examination and pay the first term of tuition, and this with no serious investigation of the candidate's personality or his latent possibilities of progress, his capability or usefulness to himself or to others. But if the university's duty is a duty toward a nation, its attitude regarding student admissions must naturally be based on a different principle. In my opinion, the duty of a university is to form men in the various domains of human thought in such fashion that part of them, at least, can become leaders in their respective fields, thus serving the nation." Unquote. Here then is a well-established principle, adds Professor Cusa, quote, "The duty of universities is towards their nation, for which they must prepare leaders in all fields, and these must be necessarily ethnically native. For it is intolerable that a nation educate for itself alien leaders at its universities." Unquote. From the preceding figures, one can deduce the grave problem of the Romanian leading class of tomorrow. There remains a well-established truth. Romania ought to be led by Romanians. Is there anyone who claims that Romania ought to be led by Jews? If not, then one has to admit that Romanian student youth is right and that all campaigns, all wrongs, all infamies, all provocations, all plots, all injustices that are heaped and are going to be heaped upon this Romanian youth find their justification in the war waged by Jewry for the extermination of Romanians and of their best fighters. Continuing next section here, the problem of national culture. A people, considering this the gravest of all problems, is like a tree concerned with the problems of its fruit. When it sees itself overwhelmed by caterpillars, it can no longer fulfill its mission to the world, cannot bear fruit, then it would have to face the saddest problem, greater even than the problem of life itself, for seeing its aim in life destroyed, it would be more painful for it that were it to be dead. The greatest pains are those of useless efforts, because they are the pains of resulting from the frightful consciousness of the usefulness of life. Is it not frightening that we, the Romanian people, no longer can produce fruit? That we do not have a Romanian culture of our own, of our people, of our blood, to shine in the world side by side with that of other peoples? That we be condemned today to present ourselves before the world with products of Jewish essence? That today, at this moment, when the world expects that the Romanian people appear to show the fruit of our national blood and genius, we present ourselves with an infection of Judaic cultural caricature? We look at this problem with hearts constricted with anguish, and there will be no Romanian who, seeing this entire history endangered, will not reach for his weapon to defend himself. I reproduce here from Professor Gavanescu's The Imperative of the Historical Moment these immortal lines, quote, "The principal concerns of the Romanian people, just as important to its being as its physical preservation, is its affirmation in the realm of humanity's ideal of life, the creation of a culture specifically of Romanian character. It is impossible that a Romanian culture evolve from a school or an economic or political organization of alien character. An institution, as a function of national life, has a Romanian character only when the human factor giving birth is Romanian." Unquote. Faced with this sad situation, faced by the large number of invaders overwhelming us, Professor Gavanescu, posing the question of a national school and culture, asked himself full of anxiety, quote, "Where can Romanian souls seek refuge? Where can they escape the obsessing painful impression of being exiles in their own country? Excepting the church, where can they enter to collect their thoughts in quiet, under the protection of the saving cross? Their only refuge is the school. The school is the ideal nest in which national genius gathers its progeny to nurture it, to raise it, to teach it how to fly, to show it the way to heights that only the national genius knows, and only it is meant to reach. The school is the place of refuge where the nation's heartstrings and the spiritual organs of the people are tuned in order to intone a new symphony as yet unheard in the world, the first symphony of its natural talents predestined by God exclusively to its being. The school is the sanctuary where the great mystery of a people's life unfolds, where the ethnic soul distills in drops of light its immortal essence so that it be molded into the ideal form preordained to it exclusively by the world's creative thought. The melodic instruments of other ethnic souls cannot harmoniously participate in the symphony of our culture. By virtue of their makeup, they know only how to sound the note of their people. What kind of Romanian symphony could they produce? The essence of national genius of other ethnic souls cannot crystallize in a different form from that determined for them by the creator of peoples. How can one produce a Romanian image from the Jewish, Magyar, or German national essence?" Unquote. Not only will the Jews be incapable of creating Romanian culture, but they will falsify the one we have in order to serve it to us poisoned. The Romanian school thus being macerated, we are placed in the position of renouncing our mission as a people, of renouncing the creation of a Romanian culture, and of perishing from Jewish poison. So this next part of the chapter is now titled The Return to Romania. In contrast to our colleagues from the other universities, we Aisian students knew all these things from the lectures of Professor Cuza, the writings of Professor Palescu and Gavanescu, from our studies and research done at the Association of Law Students, and from what we saw with our own eyes and felt with our own souls. A problem of great conscience posed itself for us. Every day brought us additional proof. We recognized the perfidiousness of the Jewish press. We saw its bad faith in all circumstances. We saw its incitations behind everything anti-Romanian. We saw the work of flattery and elevation of political figures, functionaries, authorities, writers, Christian priests, who stooped to do the bidding of Jewish interests. We saw the ridicule heaped upon those who adopted a correct, dignified Romanian attitude, or those who dared denounce the Jewish peril. We saw the indecency with which we were trained in our land, as if they had been masters here for thousands of years. We saw with ever-glowing indignation the daring meddling of these uninvited guests into the most intimate problems of Romanian life: religion, culture, art, politics, they seeking to trace lines along which the destiny of the Romanian people should move. Young as I was, almost a child, I was long troubled by these thoughts while searching for a solution. The elements which impressed me the most, that then determined me to fight, that were comforted and straining me in times of suffering, were 1. The consciousness of mortal danger in which our people and its future found itself. 2. My love for the land, and the sorrow for every sacred and glorious place today ridiculed and profaned by Jews. 3. The pity for the ashes of those who had fallen for their country. 4. The feeling of revolt against the offenses, too, as well as the ridicule and trampling underfoot by this alien enemy of our dignity as human beings and as Romanians. That is why, when on December 10th, 1922, I heard the great news, the volcanic explosion of the student movement, I decided to return home so that I too might fight side by side with my comrades. A short time later, the train was taking me home. From Krakow, I sent a telegram to the students in Cernaudi, who were expecting me at the station. I stayed there for 2 days. The university was closed. The students guarding it seemed like soldiers serving their country, their soul enlightened by God. No trace of personal interest clouded their beautiful and sacred nation. The cause for which they banded together and fought as one went much beyond themselves and their constant privations and needs. In Cernaudi, the leading fighters were Tudos Popescu, the son of the old priest from Marsetti, county of Dambovita, a third-year student in theology. Then Ileanu, Pavlescu, Cristianu, etc. I inquired about the plan of battle. It was decided to declare a general strike until we won, namely until the government satisfactorily solved the problems raised in the notion of December 10th, beginning with numerus clausus. To me, this plan seemed wrong. In my head, another one began to form. The student movement ought to reach out to all the Romanian people. Limited now to universities, it should be extended into a Romanian national movement, because for one thing, the Jewish problem is not limited to the universities, but involves the whole Romanian nation, and for another, the universities by themselves cannot solve it. This national movement must be incorporated into an organization under a single command. The aim of this organization must be fighting to bring the national movement to power, which will resolve both numerus clausus and all other problems, for no other rule by political parties outside of this movement will resolve the national problem. With these points in mind, the students should organize a great national assembly of Romanians from all social strata, which would then signal the beginning of the new organization. In order to implement this assembly, each university should provide as many flags as there are countries in each province, as there are counties in each province. The cloth for each being then given by a student delegation there to a nationalist whom the delegates would consider the best qualified person for the job of gathering round him a group of town and country leaders. Then, upon receiving the telegram announcing a week ahead of time and the date and place of the rally, he would start for that place with the flag and all his men. Lest the government try to prevent the rally, all preparation should be made quietly, keeping the date unknown until the last minute. I outlined this plan to about 50 fighters in one of the dormitories. They considered it good. Then we all pitched in money, bought the necessary cloth, and right away, girl students started making flags for the counties of Bukovina. And in the next section here, it's very short, titled At Iasi. In Iasi, I met all my former comrades. I exposed my plan to them as well. Here, too, the flags were made the first day by girl students for all counties in Moldavia and Bessarabia. I could not find Professor Cuza. He had left for Bucharest together with Professor Sumulianu and my father to attend a meeting at the capital. Next section of this chapter, at Bucharest. The next day I left for Bucharest. Here I went to see the Professor Cuza and Sumulianu and my father, who for over a quarter of a century had been fighting together against the Jewish menace, being overwhelmed by ridicule, blows, and even wounds, and who today experienced the great satisfaction of seeing this entire educated youth of the country, numbering over 30,000, raising battle banners for the faith they had served for a lifetime. But in Bucharest, my thoughts were not received with the same enthusiasm. First, because I encountered some opposition from Professor Cuza, presenting my plan proposing the creation of a national movement, headed by him as a chief. In the rally to be held, he did not consider my plan good because, said he, quote, "We do not need to organize. Our movement is based on a formidable mass current," unquote. I insisted, comparing a mass movement to an oil well, that, unconnected to a pipeline, even when it gushes, it comes to naught because the oil spills all over. I left, however, with no success, but next day Professor Sumulianu and my father convinced him. But I was soon confronted by a difficulty I had not expected. It was around the beginning of February. The great body of students was overflowing with enthusiasm, though all its mess halls were closed down and the gates of all dormitories locked against us, being thus left out to starve in the middle of the winter. Yet the Romanians were enthusiastic, admirably protected by the capital's Romanians, who the very next day opened wide the doors of their homes, sheltering and feeding over 8,000 student fighters. There was in this gesture an approval, an urge to struggle, a solidarization, a comfort for those being wounded. But I had no contact with this mass. I knew no one there, though the student Fanica Anactiscu, who was the manager of the review Aperia Națională, which means the national defense. I began to meet a few. I had the impression that the leaders of the student movement in Bucharest were not sufficiently oriented, For though elite elements endowed with distinguished intellectual qualities, a fact verified by the functions they later occupied in society, they found themselves unexpectedly heading a movement to which up to then they had given no thought. In fact, there were many. Each had a different opinion. Among the valuable elements of the leadership figured in the forefront Cretu, Danulescu, Simonescu, Rapianu, Roventa, and others. The mass was warlike, but part of the leadership thought it wise to calm down such high spirits. On the other hand, both their insufficient familiarity with the Jewish question and the inadequate contact with politicians made at least some of them try to some extent to reposition the movement onto a material plane, something that in my opinion was inadmissible. For this would have been as if someone were to say, 1. We fight to take our country back from the Jews. 2. We fight for white bread on our tables. 3. We fight for 2-course meals. 4. We fight for a more comfortable bed. 5. We fight for equipment in our laboratories for dissection instruments, etc. 6. We fight for more dormitories so that in the end the authorities would tell us loudly, quote, student demands have been satisfied. The government has recognized the pitiful state of students' lot, their great misery, etc. Out of the 6 points demanded, 5 were allowed. Dissection instruments, laboratory equipment, 2 white loaves of bread daily, 2-course meals, 3 student dormitories with comfortable beds, etc. Unquote. As to the first point, saving the country from Jewish hands, nothing would be said, on the pretext that the government conceded 5 points out of 6. From the beginning of the movement, that the entire Jewish press sought to shift onto this material plane, that the objective of the movement be a, quote, loaf of bread, unquote. Thus the real objective, the Jew, would escape unnoticed. In fact, if one troubles to reread the papers, one observes that Romanian politicians also posed the problem in similar terms. Students must be given dormitories, better food, etc. As I have said, part of the student leadership in Bucharest were inclined toward this propensity. Had the students taken this course, they would have strayed from their true mission. My opinion was always contrary to this point of view, against any intrusion of a material order into the formulation of student demands, for I was saying, as I also say today, it was not the immediate needs or material wants that impelled students toward this great movement, but on the contrary, it was the abandonment of concern for such things, of selfish interests, of their own or family sufferings. It was the forgetting of all these things on the part of the Romanian students, the identification of their whole being with the worries, needs, and aspirations of their people. It was this abnegation and only this that lighted the holy night in their eyes, that lighted the holy light in their eyes. The student movement was not one of material demands. It raised itself above the needs of a generation, entwining itself with the superior aspirations of the nation. On the other hand, here in Bucharest, the idea predominated that the student movement ought to stay within the university's confines, to remain an academic movement, not become a movement of a political nature. But this opinion was a totally incorrect one, for it coincided with the designs of the Jews and political parties, who had the greatest interest in restricting this fiery movement to the university, so that there, by one means or another, it could be extinguished. Our opinion was not that we had formed a government in order to agitate, but to gain a victory. Formed a movement in order to agitate, but to gain a victory. Our student forces alone being insufficient for that, we needed to unite with all Romanians. In addition, the Bucharest soldiers opposed having Professor Cuza proclaimed president of an eventual organization, claiming he was not good for such active leadership. I insisted that we must support him, such as he is. Finally, those in Bucharest held great reservations toward me. This pained me, for I was coming to them with what a man has the most clean and most sacred in his heart. with a live desire to cooperate in the best possible manner for our country. Perhaps not knowing me, they were justified in having reservations. For these reasons, I encountered opposition in Bucharest. That is why I began to work outside the committee, and we only made 3 or 4 flags. Next part of the chapter here, it's like a paragraph long. It's called At Cluj, C-L-U-J. I left for Cluj together with Alexandria Ghica, one of Miss Constanta Ghica's 3 sons of Iasi, who were the ruler's great-grandsons who throughout the student campaign acted admirably. The president of the Cluj Student Center was Alexa, a moderate good element. He received me with the same arguments regarding both student orientation and the proclaiming Professor Cuza as president of the new movement. The student mass was staunch and full of enthusiasm. It was then that I met Moda, an agile, talented youth. He held the same opinions as Alexa. I tried to convince him, but unsuccessfully. I had a difficult time. I knew no one, yet I found a few students on my side. Corneliu Codreanu, student in pharmacy, Isaac Mocanu from letters, Krasmaru in medicine, Justin Aliciu, etc. We made only 1 flag, then in Captain Sianku's house, who from the first moment with the great enthusiasm agreed to our plan of action. We took an oath on this flag. Next part of the chapter, the Assembly of Iasi, March 4th, 1923, the founding of the League of National Defense. Once returned to Iasi, I had before me 2 roads of parallel activity. One, laying the groundwork for the rally, for which flags were made in all universities. 2, continuing the student movement and keeping the general strike going. Regarding the first point, the biggest difficulty was not the lack of men or lack of organization, or the government's measures. This time, the greatest obstacle was coming from Professor Cuza himself, who, though not disproving it, showed lack of enthusiasm. Professor Cuza was not sufficiently convinced of the necessity for organizing, and not believe at all in the possibility of success for the projected rally. Regarding the second point, I faced serious difficulties with the leaders in the Bucharest and Cluj centers, difficulties which prevented agreement on a single point of view toward a battle plan around which perfect unity of this new world could be realized, raising up with all its united strength in defiance of the enemy and all our past errors. Neither the leadership nor the body of those student centers knew the Jewish problem, particularly did not know the Jew, were not aware of the Judaic power, its way of thinking and of action. They began waging war without knowing the adversary. B, they believed the then liberal government, or eventually the one to succeed it, to which we would promise our support, would satisfy our demands. On this basis, they preferred to engage in diplomacy, believing that ultimately they would convince the politicians of the justice of our cause. I believe there is nothing more distressing than discussing a problem with men who are not even familiar with its most elementary aspects. Regarding this situation, I took the following steps. 1. That several good delegates of Iasi Center regularly take part in the meetings of the Central Committee in Bucharest. Since here in parentheses, the meetings of this committee were regularly held 2 and 3 times a week. They begin at 9 in the evening, lasting to 3, 4, 5, and even 7 o'clock in the morning, in contradictory discussions. For many of those participating, the only recollections of the student movement were of these meetings with their rhetorical encounters within the committee. That's the end of the parentheses. 2, that at Bucharest and Cluj, a group of the best fighters from the student body be formed in order to work independent of the directives by their respective centers. At Cluj and Bucharest, these groups were formed very quickly. In Bucharest, they were present right in the committee, where leadership bumped into stiff opposition at each meeting. In Bucharest, Ibralianu, the delegate from Iasi, was of real help. Likewise, the firm attitude of Simionescu, the leader of the medical students, had kept the student body in the true spirit. Regarding the arrangements for the assembly, according to news received from Iasi, the outlook was as follows. In only 2 weeks, over 40 flags had been issued in 40 countries to trustworthy people. It was only natural that, after 2 months of student movement of general strike in all universities, the soul of Romanians would bubble, and that day would be ready everywhere to arise, awaiting but the word. The flags and the news of the rally came on time. Professor Cusa wanted to fix the date for the rally sometime in May so that more people would come. I opined that the rally should be held as soon as possible for the following reasons. 1. All the people on their feet rallying around the student movement were expecting to hear a command from somewhere in order to form a unit, to know that a plan was established which they could follow. 2. I was afraid that Jewry and Masonry, getting wind of the situation, might initiate a pseudo-nationalist organization in order to tap the people and thus divert the movement onto a dead-end track. In any case, this would have created such confusion in the minds of the Romanians that it was not at all to be contemplated. 3. I felt it was necessary to support the front line of the student movement, for waging war is not easy, with blows coming from all directions, government, local authorities, parents, professors, with poverty, hunger, cold. A mobilization of the Romanian masses coming to their defense, sending them a word of encouragement, would invigorate the entire front of the movement. 4. Finally, because thousands of students were inactive, not knowing what to do, they demonstrated once, twice. They held a meeting or two, but it had been 2 months. These youth had to have something to do. Once the new organization was born, the entire multitude that could not think of what to do next would be offered a wide field of activity. They could start working the very next day, heading for villages to organize them and to win them over to the new faith. The next part of this chapter here is titled March 4th, 1923. Professor Cusa decided the rally should be held on Sunday, March 4th, 1923, to place Iasi. He had invited me to dinner. There the question was raised as to what name should be given the new organization. Captain Leffner said, "The National Defense Party, as in France." I thought it appropriate. Professor Cusa added, quote, "Not party, but league. The League of Christian National Defense," unquote, and so it was called. Then I sent out telegrams to Cernaudi, Bucharest, and Cluj containing the same message, quote, "Wedding in Iasi on March 4th," unquote. Following this, I busied myself with arranging the smallest details of preparation for the rally. The schedule was determined by Professor Cusa in agreement with Professor Sumiliano and my father at the cathedral prayer, at the university homage to Simeon Barnutiu and Marzescu in the Bagan Hall public meeting. Posters were printed announcing the Great National Assembly, the news of a big Romanian assembly in Iasi, having as its purpose the founding of a fighting organization, spread like lightning among the students of the 4 universities and then among Romanians at large. On the evening of March the 3rd, full trade loads began arriving, headed by leaders bringing with them the cloth for flags. By morning, 42 groups had arrived with 42 flags. The cloth of these flags was black, a sign of mourning. In the center, a round white spot, signifying our hope surrounded by the darkness they will have to conquer. In the center of the white, a swastika, the symbol of anti-Semitic struggle throughout the world, and all around the flag, a band of the Romanian tricolor, red, yellow, and blue. Professor Cusa had approved, while in Bucharest, the form of these flags. Now we affixed them to poles, wrapped them in newspapers, and all of us left for the cathedral, where the religious service was conducted before a crowd of over 10,000 people. All 42 flags, at the moment when they were to be blessed, were unfurled before the altar. Once blessed, they were to be taken throughout the whole country, each to have a real fortress of Romanian souls rallying around it. These flags, sent into each county, would be coagulants to gather all those of like thought and like feeling. With their solemn blessing, their impressive symbolism, and their placement in each county, a great organizational and popular orientation problem was being resolved. From the cathedral, the thousands of people, banners unfurled, formed a procession through Union Square, La Pusnescu, and Carroll Street, headed for the university. There, in a gesture of homage and veneration, wreaths were placed for the Mihail Kogalnicianu, Simeon Barnutiu, and George Marzescu, the last defender of the Article 7 of the Constitution of 1879, and ironically father of the liberal minister George Marzescu, defender of the Jews. There in the university's amphitheater was signed the founding document of the League of Christian National Defense. That afternoon, the meeting took place in Begin Hall, presided over by Gen. Ion Tarnowski. Many people who could not be accommodated in the hall stood in the street. Professor Kuza was proclaimed president of the League of Christian National Defense with great enthusiasm. The speakers were Professor Kuza, Professor Sumulianu, General Tarnoshi, my father, each county delegate, and those of the university centers. Todos Popescu, Prilipsianu, Alex, Ventanic, Dankaminiana, Novitsky, Sofran Robota. Among these myself, and then next sentence, at the end, following the reading of the motion, Professor Kuza, in conclusion, entrusted me with a mission, saying, quote, I charge with the organization of LANC, which is the Romanian abbreviation for League of Christian National Defense, for the entire country under my direct leadership, the young lawyer C.Z. Codreanu, unquote. Then he named the county leaders. The rally ended in perfect order and great enthusiasm. Next section of this chapter, other anti-Semitic and nationalist organizations. Small anti-Semitic organizations of an economic and political character existed even before 1900, as well as after. These were weak efforts of people with foresight and love of country to oppose the ever-growing Jewish invasion. But the most serious anti-Semitic organization was the Nationalist Democratic Party, founded on April 23, 1910, under leadership of Professors N. Iorga and A.C. Kuza. This party had a whole administrative program. Its article number 45 gave the solution to the Jewish problem. Quote, the solution to the Jewish problem must be accomplished through the elimination of Jews, the development of productive powers of Romanians, and the protection of their enterprises, unquote. Following the enumeration of these points, one reads this solemn statement, quote, we will keep, spread, and defend this program with all our steadfastness and power, considering this our first honor duty, unquote. This organization gathered together all veteran fighters since 1900. Among the prominent ones, one counted Professor Sumulianu, Professor Ion Zelia Codreanu, Butirano and Dorohi, Tony and Galati, C.N. Ephraim, and then later Stefan Petrovici, C.C. Koroiu, and others. In 1914, all these were leading the movement that demanded Romania enter the war for Transylvania's liberation, and in 1916 most of them were on the front lines brilliantly doing their duty. Ever since 1910 to 1911, the counties of Dorohi, under the leadership of lawyer Buturianu Iasi, under that of Professor Kuza, and Sukivana, under that of my father, became fortresses of Romanian rebirth. By 1912, the current in these counties was so powerful that in the elections, the administration could not avoid a sound of feet without the use of terror. On that occasion, my father was seriously wounded. Immediately after the war, when the peasants returned home from the front, resolutely desiring a new life, the first elections brought into Parliament Professor Kuza for Iasi and my father for Sukiava. There they engaged in a fierce paramilitary fight applauded by the whole country. The fight was waged against the peace that the Germans, whose armies invaded our country, wished to impose upon us. The echo of these truly remarkable clashes gathered the hopes of the country around the Nationalist Democratic Party, so that in the elections that followed, real formidable victories were registered. In Sukiava, the victory was unparalleled. Out of the 7 deputy seats, the administration took 1, the other groups none, and my father's list 6. In Dorohoi and Iasi, almost the same. The trains looked toward Bucharest 34 nationalist deputies. But unfortunately for the Romanian people, this whole troop coming up from all corners of the country ended up in a great defeat. This struck like lightning over the heads of Romanians. The Judeo-Masonic forces succeeded in dividing the two-party chiefs, Professor Nicolae Iorga from A.C. Cuza. Nicolae Iorga did not oppose the treaty imposing on us the quote-unquote minorities clause, declaring himself ready to sign it. Professor Cuza on the opposite barricade shows that this infamous minorities clause represents defiance of all the blood shed by Romanians, an impermissible meddling into our national affairs, and a beginning of misfortune for us. In effect, the imposition was placed upon us to grant Jews political rights en masse. For some time, Iorga had not been an anti-Semite, and it was clear that the break was an irreparable one. And this unfortunate Romanian nation again became heartbroken over its hopes for salvation. The majority of the party's membership and parliamentarians sided with Professor Nicolae Iorga, believing that Professor Cuza's position placed him further away from any chances to gain power. With Professor Cuza stood only Professor Sumulianu and my father. Next section of this chapter, titled The Romanian National Fascia and the Romanian Action. In 1923, during the student movement and under the impetus of the wave of nationalism, the Romanian National Fascia came into being under the leadership of Fivor Dujulescu, Bagulescu, and in Cluj, the Romanian Action, led by Professors Catuniau, Siortia, Iluiu Hatagan, Vasilu Cluj, and a group of students headed by Moda. The former published the weekly Fascism, well-written and spirited, but they did not know the Jewish problem. The latter published the bi-monthly Romanian Action and later Romanian Brotherhood, also very well-written, but they limited themselves only to publishing. They could not initiate any action or create a sound organization. During this time, the student Moda translated from French the Protocols Elder of Zion, which were commented upon by Professor Catunianu and Vasilu Cluj, then published in booklet form. Also, at about that time, Vasil Cluj published his work The Demographic Situation of Romania, in which he showed statistically the terrible state of Romanian towns. These two organizations had neither power of action nor organization, nor a doctrinal competence like that of the League of the Christian National Defense, lasting only till 1925 when they merged with the latter. After the founding of the League of Christian National Defense, my activity was to continue along two lines, that of the student movement as a separate unit organized by centers, having as an immediate objective its own battles in which it had been engaged for 3 months, and that of LANC, in which I was given the function of organizer under Professor Cuza. On the student side, I was to fight for A, maintaining the posture of the general strike, which involved the honor of students. Quite a difficult job, considering the attacks, blows, pressures, lures that flowed over the heads of students everywhere. In addition, there were defeatist students, partisans of believers in defeat who had to be checked. B, systematically using available student elements to recruit among all Romanian masses, thus organizing them in the single army, LANC. On the LANC side, we had leaders and flags in some 40 counties. We needed A, the completion of flags for the remaining counties, B, as tight a contact as possible with the respective leaders, C, the immediate setup of precise guidelines in organizational matters, so far non-existent but requested by county chiefs who did not know how to proceed. In resume, defensive on student lines, offensive on LANC lines, the large mass of students acted, guided by their healthy instinct of our race and by the spirit of the dead. It followed its glorious path, overcoming many difficulties. With the League, the problems were somewhat more serious. County chiefs were asking for clarifications and guidelines for organizing. People who were moved by this current had to be strained in their faith, indoctrinated, fully informed regarding the organizing and the objectives they had to reach in their fight. They had to be taught discipline and trust in their superiors. We were not then giving birth to a movement, but already had a full-fledged movement which had to be organized, disciplined, indoctrinated, and led into battle. When I went to Professor Cusa with the letters and requests received, he was disarmed by them, for they introduced him to a strange new world. Shining like a sun and unchallengeable on the heights of the theoretical world, when he was brought down to earth on the battlefield, he became powerless. Quote, "We have no need of regulations. Let them organize by themselves," unquote. Or, quote, "We are not in barracks to need discipline," unquote, he oftentimes told us. Then I began to write up a statute myself, down to the last detail. But realizing this was a tough job for my age, I took it to my father, and working at it several days, I effected the needed modifications in form and substance. The organizing system was simple, but different from that of the political parties up to then. The difference was that in addition to the political organization proper, based on county village committees and members, I formed separately a youth corps, organized by 10 and hundreds. Our political organizations up to then had nothing like these. Later, they too adopted them in form of the Liberal Party Youth, National Peasantry Party Youth, etc. When I presented the statute to Professor Cusa, the matter took on the character of real war. He would not hear of such a thing. Then an embarrassing discussion ensued for several hours between Professor Cusa and my father, which literally froze me. Suspecting that it would possibly lead to an unfortunate conflict, I regretted being the cause of this discussion. My father, a violent and rough man, took the statute and left for the printer to have it published without Professor Cusa's approval. But the latter, exercising more tact and calmer, as much as he was adamant in certain matters, was just as malleable in cases like these, and knew how to quiet things. He called my father back, telling him, quote, "All right, let us print it, but give me a chance to look it over," unquote. He corrected it, rearranged it, added to it a doctrinaire section, appeals, manifestos, then sent it to the printer. This then became, quote, "The Good Romanian's Guide," unquote, and later that of the LANC, the fundamental book of the League until 1935. I was satisfied that something good and absolutely necessary for the organization was really accomplished, but in my heart I was telling myself, quote, "Things are going to be tough if we need so much discussion for such elementary questions. In an organization, neither the lack of comprehension in a chief nor too much discussion are good," unquote. That's the last part of this section. Now we're at a new section titled Modification of Art 7 of the Constitution, March 1923, the granting of civil rights to the Jews. It was rumored for a long time that the Liberal Parliament, which was also the Constituent Assembly, thus having the mission of rewriting the Constitution, intended to modify Art 7 in the sense of granting, quote, "citizenship and political rights to all Jews present in Romania," unquote. Up to now, this article of the old Constitution prohibited the granting of citizenship to foreigners, and thus constituted a real defense shield against the invasion and meddling of the Jews in the administration of our own Romanian destiny. Giving this privilege of meddling in Romania's public affairs to as high as 2 million Jews, and to the just settled Jew on our land, the right of equality with the Romanian who lived on this land for millennia, was both an injustice, crying to high heaven, and a great national menace that could not but worry and profoundly shake every Romanian who loved his country. Confronted by the situation, Professor Cusa had written a series of immortal articles showing the menace threatening the future of this nation, and the League distributed petitions throughout the country to be signed by Romanians, by which it was demanded that Art 7 of the Constitution be maintained as such. The petitions were filled with hundreds of thousands of signatures and forwarded to the Constituent Assembly. I thought it indicated that we as students, while this grave question was being deliberated, should go from all centers to Bucharest, where together with the local students and the population we would demonstrate in order to stop the act enslaving our future. I left for Cernaudi, Cluj, and Bucharest. Students accepted my proposition and began organizing for the departure. In order to indicate the departure date, it was agreed I should send a causal telegram, but the plan failed. We had expected that the deliberations around this question would last at least 3 days, during which time we could reach Bucharest. But on March 26th, the deliberations lasted less than half an hour. The Liberal government, as well as the Assembly, seemingly conscious of the act of great shame they were about to commit, sought to cover it, passing it as unnoticeably as they could. The next day, following this great act of national betrayal, the so-called Romanian press, as well as the Jewish one, treated the infamous act with silence. The papers The Morning, The Fight, The Truth, daily printed in bold-face the conflict between landlords and renters in Bucharest, and in a corner several words by which they announced simply and perficiously, quote, Art 7 of the old Constitution has been replaced by Art 133, unquote. The Liberal Party of the infamous Assembly of 1923 thus laid in the grave and sealed the tombstone over the future of this people. No curse of our children, of our mothers, of our old folks, of all Romanians suffering on this earth, now and forever, will be adequate to punish these traitors to their nation. Thus, in silence and in an atmosphere of general cowardice was consummated this great act of national betrayal. Only Professor Cuza's voice, the personality now towering over the entire Romanian nation, could be heard. Quote, Romanians, the March 28, 1923 Constitution must be abolished immediately. Protest against its promulgation. Demand free elections. Organize in order to ensure your victory. A new Constitution must guarantee the Romanian nation's rights of priority as the dominant people in the state, unquote. When I heard the news in Iasi, I burst out crying, and I told myself, quote, it cannot be. At least people ought to learn we protested. For if the people on whose necks is placed such a yoke does not protest, it is a people of imbeciles, unquote. Then I edited a manifesto addressed to Aisans, calling all Romanians to protest a meeting at the university. The news of the Jews being granted civil rights spread like lightning. The town was seething. On governmental orders, local authorities brought out the army, the gendarmes, the police. Provocations arose, followed by the interdiction of the movement. Then the plan was changed. The rally, instead of being held at the university, took place at 14 points throughout the city. There is where the demonstrations and the clashes began that lasted all night. Local authorities, the army and police forces, were completely baffled by the abrupt change of our plans of battle, of our meeting place, and by running from one end of the city to another, as they were informed by their agents regarding demonstrations which erupted every half hour at opposite points. The group under my command met at the toughest point. Podorasu and T.G. Susuli, where the Jewish impertinence maintained that never will an anti-Semitic demonstrator set foot and get out alive. No Romanian lives there. Thousands of Jews woke up and ran to and fro like a nest of worms. When we were greeted with fire, we responded with fire. We did our duty, toppling everything that stood in our path, and showing the Jews that Iasi, Moldavia's ancient capital, was still Romanian, and that there it is our arm which rules, which can permit or forbid, which holds peace or war, which punishes or forgives. The next day the cavalry from Barlot arrived in the city to help the two local regiments, the police, gendarmerie, and the Jews, and the Bucharest papers came out in special editions with headlines such as, quote, Iasi had lived a night and a day of revolution, unquote. This is how much we could do, merely children. This much we knew how to do, and at the moment the yoke was put on our shoulders. We did not accept it serenely, with a slave's resignation with cowardice. That much we did, and took the sacred oath for all of our life to break this yoke, no matter how many battles and sacrifices would be expected of us. I went to the police prefecture the following day to take some food to those arrested. There, Ilyuan Sarbu was just then being interrogated, as he was suspected of being the author of the manifesto. Seeing that, I went before the investigator and said, Sarbu is not the author of the manifesto, I am, unquote. And this leads to the next section titled, My First Arrest. At the police station I was told, quote, Mr. Codreanu, you must go to the courthouse accompanied by the agent, unquote. So now we got the pigs lashing down on Codreanu. Always doing the work of the Jews. Whoever's given them their pensions, their money bags. So let's continue here. Quote, "Why with the agent?" unquote, I replied back. Quote, "I go alone." Unquote. This was the first time that my word was doubted. I felt offended. Quote, "No, I do not go with the agent. He can, if he wishes, walk 60 feet behind me. I go alone. My word is worth more than 20 police agents." Unquote. I left with the agent walking 20 feet behind me. I reached a courthouse. The agent came along and took me before investigating Judge Katichi, who told me, quote, "You are under arrest and I must send you to the penitentiary." Unquote. When I heard that, I saw black before my eyes. At that time, arrested was something degrading. No one among Aisans was ever arrested, and no one heard of a nationalist student being arrested, let alone me, with a patriot's past. I approached his desk and told him, quote, "Your Honor, I do not accept being arrested, and nobody's going to pick me up and take me to the penitentiary." Unquote. The poor man, in order to avoid further discussion, ordered the agent to take me to the penitentiary and advised me against opposing it. Then he left. The agent tried to take me. I told him, quote, "Go home, man, and leave me alone. You cannot take me from here." Unquote. And then other agents came in. I stayed there from 11 a.m. till 8 p.m. in the evening. All efforts to take me out were fruitless. I was thinking, quote, "I am guilty of no wrongdoing. I did my duty to my people. If there is a guilty party who ought to be arrested, that party is of those who wrong their people, the parliament that accorded civil rights to the Jews." Unquote. Finally, all courthouse employees went home one by one, down to the ushers. Only the agents by my side and myself were left. Around 8 o'clock, 3 officers arrived. Quote, "Mr. Codreanu, we have orders to evacuate this courthouse." Unquote. Followed by another quote, "All right, gentlemen, I will go out." Unquote. We descended the stairs and got out of the building. To my surprise, I saw there a company of gendarmes in semicircle, prosecutors, judges, police. At that, I walked ahead and sat down in the middle of the courtyard. The authorities came to me and said, quote, "You must go to the penitentiary." Unquote. He responded, Codreanu, with, quote, "I will not go." Unquote. They lifted me up, put me into a vehicle, and I was transported to the penitentiary slowly, followed by the gendarme company on foot. At the last moment, as we were going through the gate of the prison, our boys attempted to free me, but the agents' revolvers stopped them. Was it a protest against the laws? No. It was one against the yoke of injustice. My obstinate refusal to let myself be arrested seemed to be for me a foreboding of much suffering to come my way, once taking the path which led me inside the cold walls of prisons. I was kept there 1 week until the eve of Easter. My first days in prison. Morally speaking, I took them very hard, for I could not understand that someone could be arrested when he fights for his people, and by order of those fighting against the people. Upon being released, I went home. Many Romanians came to meet me at the railroad station, showing sympathy for me and encouraging me to carry on the fight, which is the people's fight, which in the end will be won. The entire nation in its best elements, from peasant to intellectual, received with great pain the sad news of the Art 7 modification, but it could do nothing, for it woke up and sold out and betrayed by the leaders. I wonder what curse on our heads and what sins condemned us Romanians to have part of such scoundrelly leaders. Here we have face-to-face 2 historical moments in 2 different Romanias, with 2 sets of people and with the same problem. The Constituent Assembly of 1879 in small Romania, very small, that had the courage to withstand Europe's pressure, and the Constituent Assembly of 1923 in greater Romania, emerged from the sacrifice of our blood, which out of venal servility under the pressures of the same Europe does not hesitate to humiliate and endanger the life of an entire nation. And this leads us to the next section here of this chapter, The Great Men of Romania of 1879. The Veil of Forgetfulness. In the pages that follow, the readers of the book will encounter with some surprise a series of extracts from the works of several pinnacles of thought, patriotism, and character of our people, who in 1879 fiercely fought with the right to life of the Romanian people, confronting with manliness the threatening lightnings of all Europe. Though the inclusion of these extract overtax and complicate the normal unfolding of the present volume, disobeying rules customarily followed in such matters, I include them not so much wishing to use them as historical arguments, but to bring light anew these pearls of reasoning and expression of these great forebears, whom the conspiracy of the Judeo-Masonic occult persecuted, locking them up under heavy seals and plaques of forgetfulness just because they wrote, thought, and fought like true giants of Romanianism. Our student generation, jumping over 50 years of the abdication practiced by politicians vis-a-vis the Jewish peril, identifies itself with the same convictions, sentiments, and character possessed by those of 1879, and in the moment of this sacred union bows its head in gratitude and reverence in the shadow of their greatness. And this leads us to the next part of this chapter, titled Vasil Kanta. Consider the attitude our great Kanta held in the chamber in 1879. 50 years earlier, the Romanian philosopher demonstrated with unshakable scientific arguments, framed in a system of impeccable logic, the soundness of racial truths that must lie at the foundations of the national state, a theory adopted 50 years later by the same Berlin, which had imposed on us the granting of civil rights to the Jews in 1879. From this, one can see the frailty of the arguments of those who attack the national movement as being inspired by the new German ideology, when in reality, after so many years, it is Berlin that has taken up the line of Vasil Kanta, Mihail Ionescu, and others. Quote, "We, if we will not fight against the Jewish element, will perish as a nation. It is a recognized fact, even by those attacking us today, that the first condition for a state to exist, and proper, is that the citizens of the state be of the same race, blood, and this is easy to understand. First, individuals of like race usually marry only among themselves, for only thus can they retain a unity of race. Then marriage creates the family feelings, which are the strongest and most lasting ties between individuals, and when we consider that these family ties spread out until they take in all the citizens of the state, we see that the latter are attracted to one another by a general feeling of love, by what is called a racial sympathy. Moreover, bearing in mind that the same blood flows through the veins of all members of the people, one understands that all these members will have, through heredity, about the same feelings, about the same tendencies, and even about the same ideas, so that in perilous times, on unique occasions, their hearts will beat as one, their minds will adopt one opinion, the action of all will seek the same purpose. In other words, the nation made up of a single race will have only one center of gravity, and the state made up of such a nation that, and only that one, will be in the best condition of strength, durability, and progress. In consequence, just as in the maintenance of a species, the first prerequisite for the existence of a state is that its people be of like race. Well, this is the truth on which the principle of nationalities is based, on which so much is being said in the civilized world. The principle of nationalities, naturally, refers only to race, not at all to what is called the subjects of the state regardless of race, for then the principle would have no application whatever. Well, this principle is today so deeply rooted in the conscience of all people, be they statesmen or simple citizens, that nowadays all states in the civilized world come into being or are reconstituted only on this basis. Then let the Jewish publicists or the Jew lovers no longer say that the basis of the state is only a common material interest of its citizens, because, on the contrary, we see that it is exactly this, our century, that gave birth to the principle of nationalities that prevails today more and more. Quote, "True," and these are all just quotes, just him picking out quotes from this specific person. This is a new one now. "True, this does not prevent foreigners from acquiring the citizenship of a state, provided they assimilate into the dominant nation, namely to mix totally so that ultimately the state remain of the same blood. These are the scientific principles of naturalization. For naturalization to be useful, rational, and conforming to scientific criteria, it must be granted only to those foreigners who assimilate or are inclined to do so by marriage to the indigenous. Otherwise, one can easily comprehend that granting citizenship to individuals who lack or cannot have this inclination of assimilation into the blood of the dominant race would result in a country subject to perpetual struggles between opposite tendencies. I am not saying it is possible for various races that would exist in some country to have a common interest, that the hereditary tendencies of one race be just as favored as those of another by the same circumstances. As long as this state of affairs lasted, both indigenous and naturalized would certainly live peacefully. But circumstances changed, and with them the interests of the various races could also change. And if not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then day after tomorrow, the tendencies of the naturalized will be in conflict with those of the natives. And then the interest of some will be at odds with that of the others. Then the interests of some could not be satisfied without sacrificing those of the others. And then we would have a fight for existence between two races, with fierce battles that could only be ended either by the total abolishment of the state, or when one of the states is totally crushed, so that, again, only one dominant race remain in the state. Well, our national history and everyday experience have proved to us that from among all foreigners who come to us, the Turks, and particularly the Jews, are the ones who never intermarry with us, while other foreigners, Russians, Greeks, Italians, Germans, intermarry and fuse with us, if not on the first, then during the second or third generation. But finally, there comes a time when there is no distinction between these foreigners and ourselves, either as regards blood or love of country. But it is not the same with Jews. No matter how this question would be posed or how it would be interpreted, we, if we will not fight against the Jewish element, will perish as a nation. Okay, now we're on to the next part of the chapter titled Vasile Alexandri. While in the chamber, Vasile Kanta delivered the above-mentioned discourse in the Senate. Vasile Alexandri, the poet of the Union, expressed the feeling of Romanians as follows, quote, "Today, Romania comes to us holding in her hands her history book so that we write in its pages either the humiliation and the loss of our people or its dignity and deliverance. Faced with a situation unparalleled in the historical annals of the world, we must know how to lift our hearts and minds to the height of our duty without passion, without violence, but in quiet spirit, with enlightened patriotism and noble courage that is expected of men called to decide the fate of their country. What is this new impasse? What is this new invasion? Who are the invaders? Where do they come from? What do they want? And who is the new Moses leading them to the new promised land situated this time on the banks of the Danube? What are the invaders? They are an active, intelligent people, never tiring in the fulfillment of their mission. Adepts of the blindest religious fanaticism, the most exclusivist of all the inhabitants of the earth, the most unassimilable with other peoples of the world. What do they want from us? To become owners of the land of this people, turning the old masters of this country into the slave, as are today the peasants of Galicia and part of Bukovina. This country is beautiful and rich. It has big cities, railroads, advanced institutions, and a people of rather unforeseeing, as are all people of Latin origin. What is easier than substituting themselves for the inhabitants of this country and thus turning all of it into an Israelite property? If this is the plan of the present-day invaders, as everything leads us to believe, it once again proves the enterprising spirit of the Israelite people, and far from deserving blame, it is likely to attract the plaudits and admiration of practical men. We Romanians would deserve the blame if by our indifference or by the application of some fatal and absurd humanitarian theories, we would ourselves be helping in the fulfillment of their plan. The blame would fall upon our heads. If fooled by these theories, understanding them inside out, or dominated by an imaginary fright under the influence of imaginary threats, we would forget that the Romanian fatherland is a sacred storehouse entrusted to us by our parents to be transmitted whole and unstained to our children. What then would the whole country say if we created for it such a situation? What would the Romanians say who had joyous fought for the independence of our ancestral land? Our country would turn her eyes away from us in pain. The Romanian would say, "Ask no longer for my blood from now on." If the blood that was shed serves nothing but the fragmentation of my country and the demeaning of national dignity. For these considerations, when Romania comes before us today holding her history book in her hand so that we may inscribe on its pages our veto, For myself, I tear out the page meant for the inscription to humiliate our country, and on the other page write with my heart, its dignity, its deliverance. That's the end of this section of the chapter. Now we're on another one called Mihail Codreanu. Here is the dignified attitude regarding the Jewish problem and the pressures exercised from abroad taken by Mihail Codreanu, Minister of Internal Affairs in 1869, titular head of that same ministry which today has become the place for which emanate the orders for torturing those of us who still fight to defend our people. Quote, all those possessing a live interest in their country have been preoccupied with stopping Jews from exploiting the people. In Romania, the Jewish question is not a religious one, but a national and at the same time an economic one. In Romania, Jews not only constitute a different religious community, they constitute in the full sense of the word a nationality foreign to Romanians by virtue of origin, language, dress, customs, and even sentiment. It is not a matter then of religious persecution, for if this were the case, the Israelites would face interdiction or restriction in the exercise of their cult, which is not the case. Their synagogues would not be allowed to rise freely near Christian churches. The religious instruction, the publicity of their cult, likewise, would not be tolerated. All those who visited the principalities, in particular Moldavia, were frightened by the sad aspect, not to say worse than sad, revealed by the Polish Israelites populating our towns. When they looked more closely into the commerce, industry, and this crowd's means of livelihood, these travelers became even more frightened because they saw that the Jews are consumers only, not producers, and that their largest, and I can say their only and principal industry, is the retailing of alcohol. I evicted no Jew from his domicile on the simple basis that, according to all the laws of the land, the Israelites from Romania have no right of domicile in villages, as is also the case in Serbia. I restricted the future rental of taverns and nightclubs by Jews, especially by those called Galicians and Podolians. This measure was justified on the organic statute and on the law voted by the General Assembly, then sanctioned by Prince Mihai Sturza, which no succeeding law has to this day abolished, but on the contrary, a law all ministers of the internal affairs before and after the convention maintained and enforced. Proof of this are the orders of my predecessors, namely of June 17th and 28th, 1861, during Minister Costa Foru, of February 5th, 1866, signed by General Florescu on March 11th and April 11th, 1866, issued to the Ramnikol Sarat Prefecture by Prince Dmitry Gekya, etc., etc. Under these conditions, not one minister, not even 10 succeeding one another in office, could do other than myself and my predecessors did. Ministers of Romania, a country with a constitutional regime, we cannot govern but according to the will of the people. We are duty-bound to take into account the needs, wishes, and to a certain degree, even the prejudices of this nation. This justifies the great irritation on the part of the Romanian populace, originating out of profound suffering and of a legitimate concern. For it is the voice of a nation feeling threatened in her very nationhood and her economic interests. Foreigners can stifle this voice, but it is impermissible to a Romanian minister of any party not to listen to it. This is why, not only today, but always in all times and under all administrations, all rulers, all statesmen of Romania, all those who possess a live interest in their country, have been preoccupied by the necessity of stopping the exploitation of the Romanian people by an alien people, the Jews. That's the end of this section of the chapter. We're now on another section titled Mihail Eminescu. And this is really short, it's like less than a page long. So it starts with basically two separate quotes here. One, if today, when they do not have full civil rights or political ones, they have taken over all commerce and all small industry in Moldavia, if today they have flaunted themselves frightfully over Romanian plains, if today they are nesting in the heart of the industrious Oltenians, what will it be like tomorrow when they will be granted equal rights, when they will be able to call themselves Romanians, and when they will have inscribed into laws the formal right that this fatherland is theirs just as much as it is ours? Unquote. And on page 481, so this is from the Israelite Question. Page 481, quote, by what labors or sacrifices have they won for themselves the right to aspire to equality with the Romanian people? Was it they who fought the Turks, Tartars, Poles, and Hungarians? Was it they who were punished when the old treaties were broken? Was it through their efforts that the fame of this country spread, that this language was disinterred from the veilings of the past? Was it through one of them that the Romanian people won its right to sunlight? Unquote. That's the end of that section of the chapter here. Now we have Ian Helid Radulescu. That's the new section of this chapter. Quote, do you not see that Kaikery in England and France do not only demand citizenship rights in Romania for their co-religionists, but privileges, a supremacy? Do they want to establish an aristocracy of money, of the golden calf? They demand which we cannot give, were we to die to the last man. Does the Kaikery in England and France believe, I wonder, do you gentlemen believe with them that Romanians will watch calmly while among them will settle the most sordid and filthy, the most vulgar of aristocracies, the domination of Jews, ruffians of Mammon? Under what title and on what right could such an abominable domination be established before the atrium, before the gates of the 20th century, where all humanity except the sons of perdition will come like a bride before the divine groom? There is the Kaikery of England and France come out with the right of man based on equality, and yet have the audacity to pretend privileges and supremacy for themselves. And because they cannot invoke this right, they dare, as it struck their fancy to coin the paradox, Romanian of Israelite right, to push their specifically Jewish further audacity so far as to threaten us in the name of Europe's monarchs. With what then shall the Jews conquer us? By their numbers, with their force? For the good that we wish, and we have wished them, in the names of the regeneration of peoples and of the Jews themselves in the land of Palestine, we pity them and advise them as a Christian would, desirous for the salvation of all humanity through Christ's wounds, who from the cross forgave his tormentors themselves, not to try anything of this sort or dare to even contemplate it, let alone claim to something in our present era of agitation caused by Satan's angels who tempted them. They had better not dare something of the kind, for God only knows how far Romanians may go in their legitimate and most sacred of all tempestuous furies, defending their rights as a nation from having an instinct of preservation. Yes, end quote. Now we're on the next section of the chapter here. This is like literally a paragraph long and it's titled Bogdan Petriasu Hadshu. God knows how he even pronounced that. Quote, thus 2 ways of Jewish behavior towards us are specified in the Talmuds. If you are stronger than Christians, exterminate them. If you are weaker than Christians, flatter them. But someone weaker than I, in order to become someday stronger than I, has first to pass through a middle stage in which he is equal to me. Do you now understand, I wonder, what it means to grant so-called political rights to the Jews? Unquote. This is from Studies in Judaism. Now we're on the next section here of the chapter, which is just another paragraph titled Costache Negri. Quote, Jewry, 1/7 of our total population, is the saddest leprosy to which our weakness, our lack of foresight, and our banality condemned us. Unquote. And yeah, that's basically it. Next section here, A.D. Xenopol. We permit ourselves to introduce in the same selection of extracts the opinion of the great historian A.D. Xenopol, professor at the University of Iasi. This in view of the uncontestable authority of the scientist who had lived and seen with his own eyes the painful reality of his findings. Quote, if a Romanian decides to open a store, no Jew will cross his threshold. Thus he would be bypassed by a large clientele, while Romanians are not averse to buying from Jews. It is clear that even without price rigging, the resistance of the Romanian merchant and tradesman can be broken. A Jew will never take a Romanian into his establishment if the latter stands to learn something thereby, for Romanians are received into Jewish homes only as servants or porters. The system of exclusiveness persists strongly. In the innumerable Jewish workshops and stores which cover Moldavia from one end to the other, there is not a single Christian or Romanian apprentice. worker, foreman, accountant, cashier, salesman. Jews then practice against Romanians the most stringent economic exclusivism, which they cannot renounce, for it is prescribed by their own religion." Unquote. Next section of this chapter, the student general strike continues. So I think this is the end of all these people that he's quoting, and he's now going into the actual story of himself, which probably most of you are going to be more interested in. After Easter, the fight recommenced. On the LANC front, Professor Kuza continued action via the papers, while the rest of us busied ourselves organizing. The series of meetings in towns and villages began. On the student front, the modification of Article 7 of the Constitution brought with it changes. Student leaders in Bucharest and Cluj, who believed that a student movement would ultimately persuade the government to recognize the just demands of the students, became bitterly disappointed upon seeing that not only does the government not recognize any of their demands, but that it grants the Jews political rights. So they more and more thought of capitulating. In Cluj, this president convoked a meeting in which he suggested the best thing to do was to go back to classes. The student mass rejected his proposal, declaring that they were fighting to preserve their honor, and that the fight should be fought to the very last limit of resistance. The supporters of this thesis were Ion Moda, Corneliu Codreanu, Isaac Mocanu, and all our groups. Elect to resign and to replace him as president of the Student Center, Petru Maior, Ion Moda was elected along with a new committee. The government's assault to make students resume their classes failed this time also, but the leaders were sacrificed. Ion Moda and 6 others were forever expelled from all universities for their uncompromising attitude. In Bucharest, a group headed by Simionescu and Danulescu began to replace the leadership that had been becoming increasingly undecided and weak. Here, too, the government failed in its attempt to open classes after Easter. Next section is titled June 1923. 2 more months of heroic resistance, misery, and pressures have passed, with students exhausted. In Bucharest, the university was reopened for exams, if only for Jewish and renegade students. On opening day, the army was posted in the university. Student clashes occurred out front, but were too weak to longer deter its opening. The government's plan was to open universities one by one, leaving Iasi for the last, and presenting Iasi with the fait accompli of 3 operating universities. A week later in Cluj, several days after that at Cernaudi, the universities opened with the army present under the same conditions as in Bucharest. In another week, the difficult hour of Iasi was to come. It was isolated by the government alone, with its student forces considerably diminished. On the opening eve, knowing tomorrow morning the army would enter the university, we planned to occupy it ourselves during the night. Before dark, I sent a trusted student to enter the lobby and pulled back the bolts of 2 large windows in such a manner that this would go undetected, so that being pushed from the outside they would open. Not yet sharing this plan with anyone, I convoked at 9 o'clock meeting of 100 students in the Bayesian Hall. At 10 o'clock, we occupied the university. We raised on its facade the swastika banner. A little later, the rector of the university arrived, Professor Simionescu. He was let in. He talked to us, urging us to leave the university. We replied, explaining to him our reasons. Several hours later, he left. We organized ourselves for guard duty and stayed there the whole night. Next morning, the students arrived at the university in large numbers. Invigorated, they unanimously resolved to continue the fight. The Jewish papers were furiously attacking us. 2 days later, Cluj, in a fight, tried to retake their university from the hands of the gendarmes. After 2 more days in Bucharest and Cernaudi followed suit. These fights had led to student risings again and to the closing anew of all universities. The academic year ended. The Romanian youth had passed a unique exam in resistance, character, and solidarity. Honor to the student body, which for its steadfastness, taking so many blows, has given an example of collective will, yet unsurpassed in the history of the world's universities. No country has ever witnessed students united in a single soul and assuming unto themselves all responsibility and all risks, being able to maintain a general strike for 1 year in order to prove their faith, seeking through their demonstration to awaken the conscience of an entire nation, faced by the gravest problem of her existence. This is a beautiful page, a heroic page written by the suffering of this youth in the book of the Romanian nation. Now we're on the next section of this chapter titled The Plans of Judaism Against Romanian Nation Against the Romanian People. Whoever imagines that the Jews are some poor unfortunates arrived here haphazardly, brought by winds, pushed by fate, etc., is mistaken. All Jews over the entire world form a great collectivity bound together by blood and by the Talmudic religion. They are constituted into a very strict state, having laws, plans, and leaders making these plans. At the foundation there is the Cabal. So, we do not face some isolated Jews, but a constituted power, the Jewish community. In every city or market town where a number of Jews settle, the Cabal, which he puts in parentheses as the Jewish community there, is immediately formed. This Cabal has its own leaders, separate judicial setup, taxes, etc., and holds the entire Jewish population of that locality tightly united around itself. It is here in this tiny Cabal of market town or city that all plans are made, how to win over local politicians and authorities, how to infiltrate certain circles of interest to them, such as magistrates, officers, high officials, what plans to use to take over such and such a branch of a commerce from the hands of a Romanian, how to destroy a local anti-Semite, how to destroy an incorruptible representative of local authority who might oppose Jewish interests, what plans to apply when, squeezed beyond endurance, the populace would revolt and erupt into anti-Semitic movements. We should not delve deeper into these plans here. In general, the following methods are used. 1. For winning over local politicians. Gifts. 2. Personal favors. 3. Financing the political machine for propaganda, leaflet printing, traveling expenses, etc. If there are several bankers in town or rich Jews, each is assigned to a specific political party. And the second method here is winning over local authorities. So 1. Corruption, bribery. A policeman from the smallest town in Moldavia, in addition to the pay he receives from the state, gets monthly salary, another monthly salary or two. Once he accepts a bribe, he becomes the Jew's slave, and if he does not follow orders, then they use on him the second weapon. 2. Blackmail. If he does not comply, his bribe taking is revealed. 3. The third weapon is destruction. If they realize you cannot be swayed or subjected, they will try to destroy your searching. They will try to destroy you, searching well your weaknesses. If you drink, they will seek an opportunity to comprise you through alcohol. If you are a skirt chaser, they will send you a woman who will compromise you or destroy your family. If you are violent by nature, they will send your way another violent man who will kill you or whom you will kill and then go to prison. 4. If you lack all of these defects, then they will employ the lie, whispered or printed calumny, and denounce you to your superiors. And this is some insanely good foresight on his end. Like, he's very Codreanu 100 years ago could already pick up the patterns and all the main tactics that these Jews have been using for quite a long time. Codreanu is clearly a very well-read man, and if you read E. Michael Jones, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, these are, without question, the main methods that have been used by Jews for such a long time. I mean, using women, for example. They did that with Nero. They were doing it that long ago. Mussolini had a Jewish broad. This is a Jewish mistress. They have all these tactics, but first thing they do, and they talk about in the Protocols Elders of Zion, they love to bribe. Bribe is the first one, but they have other methods if you're not willing to take the bribe. Alright, continuing here. In the market towns and cities invaded by Jews, local authorities are either in a state of bribery, a state of blackmail, or in a state of destruction. And now we're on number 3. In order to infiltrate into various circles around some highly placed people, they use first, servility, second, board of directors, third, base personal favors, and last, flattery. Thus, all politicians are given Jewish secretaries because they are handy at doing the shopping, shining the shoes, rocking the babies, holding the briefcase, etc., while at the same time cajoling and insinuating themselves. A Romanian is not going to be as good, for he is less refined, is not perfidious, comes from the plow, and particularly because he wants to be a faithful soldier, guarding his honor, refusing to be a valet. 4. Plans to ruin a Romanian merchant. First, flanking the Romanian either with 1 or 2 Jewish merchants. 2. Selling merchandise below costs, the loss being made up by special funds given by the Cabal. Actually, I think it's Kahal. This book's really weird with how they spell. Sometimes the same word will be spelled differently in another part. But yeah, this is how Romanian merchants were ruined one by one. To these can be added, A, the commercial superiority of the Jew resulting from a commercial practice much older than that of the Romanian. B, the Jew's superiority competing under the Kahal's protection. The Romanian enjoys no protection from the Romanian state, but only miseries imposed by the local authorities corrupted by the Jews. The Romanian does not fight the next-door Jew, but the Kahal, and that is why one readily understands that the individual will be crushed if he fights the coalition. The Romanian has no one, a parent state to raise him, advise, and help him. He is left by himself to his fate while faced by the powerful Jewish coalition. It is easy to repeat the formula of all politicians of Mihalaki's category. Quote, let the Romanian become a merchant, unquote. Let these Romanian politicians sow us a single Romanian merchant who was assisted by the state, a single school that was meant to really educate merchants, not bank officials or clerks. Let them show us only one institution built by them which helped with a small capital or guided the young graduate of a commercial school on the road to commerce. It was not the Romanian who deserted the road to commerce, but these politicians who deserted their duty as leaders and counselors of the nation. The Romanian, abandoned by his leaders, was left alone to face the organized Jewish coalition, the fraudulent maneuvers, and dishonest competition, and he was defeated. But the hour will come when these leaders will have to account for their wrongdoing. Now we're on the next section here, titled, Against the Romanian Land. I repeat once again, we are not before some poor individuals who wandered here haphazardly by themselves in quest of shelter. We face a Judaic state, an army that comes into our land to conquer us. The Jewish population movements are affected against Romania according to a well-established plan. The Great Judaic Council probably seeks to establish a new Palestine on the section of land extending from the Baltic Sea down through parts of Poland and Czechoslovakia, then covering half of Romania to the Black Sea, whence they could easily establish contact by water with the other Palestine. Where is the naive person who can believe that the population movements of Jewish masses occur unplanned? They come according to the plan, but lack the courage to battle, to face risks, to shed their blood in order to justify, at least by these traits, some right to this land. How do we know these plans? We know them for certain by drawing conclusions from the enemy's movements. Any troop commander attentively following the enemy's action realizes the plans he is seeking. It is an elementary matter. Was there a leader in all the wars of this world who knew the advisory's plans because he sat in on their making? No. He knew them perfectly from what the enemy did. In order to break all the power of resistance of the Romanian people, the Jews will apply a truly unique and diabolical plan. 1. They will try to break the spiritual ties of the Romanian to heaven and to earth. To break our ties with heaven, they will engage in widespread dissemination of atheistic theories in order to separate the Romanian people, or at least some of the leaders, from God, separating them from God and their dead so they can destroy them, not by sword, but by severing the roots of their spiritual life. To break our ties binding us to the land, the material source of a nation's existence, they will attack nationalism, labeling it outmoded, and everything related to the idea of fatherland and soil in order to cut the love thread tying the Romanian people to their furrow. 2. In order to succeed in this, they will endeavor to get control of the press. 3. They will take advantage of every opportunity to sow discord in the Romanian camp, spreading misunderstandings, quarrels, and if possible to split into factions fighting each other. 4. They will seek to gain control of most of the means of livelihood of Romanians. 5. They will systematically urge Romanians to licentiousness, destroying their families and their moral fiber. 6. They will poison and daze them with all kinds of drinks and other poisons. Anyone wishing to conquer and destroy a people could do it by using the system, breaking its ties with heaven and land, introducing fratricidal quarrels and fights, promoting immorality and licentiousness, by material ruin, physical poisoning, drunkenness. All these destroy a nation more than being blasted by thousands of cannon or bombed by thousands of airplanes. Let the Romanians look back a bit to see whether against them this system has not been used with precision and tenacity. Truly a murderous system. Let the Romanians open their eyes to read the press for the last 40 years since it has been under Jewish control. Let them reread The Truth, The Morning, The Fight, The Opinion, The World, etc., and see if each page this plan does not constantly emerge. Let the Romanians open their eyes to see the disunity in present-day Romanian public life. Let them open their eyes and see well. The Jews use their plans like poison gas in a war to be used against the enemy, not their own people. They propagate atheism for Romanians, but they themselves are not atheistic, as they fanatically hold to respecting their most minute religious precepts. They want to detach Romanians from their love of their land, but they grab land. They rise up against the national idea, but they remain chauvinistically loyal to their own nation. Alright, now we're on the next section of this chapter, against the student movement. Whoever believes that the forces of Jewish power have no plans for the student movement is mistaken. Being so far fooled in their expectations, Jews remained disoriented for a moment. They tried to expose the students by maneuvering the workers in the communist movement, namely other Romanians, but they were not successful because on one hand these workers were drained of strength, and on the other they too began to realize that we fight and suffer for their rights and for the Romanian nation. Many of them were, in their hearts, on our side. The Jews, realizing their failure to put the workers across our path, then set the government and all the politicians against the students. By what means? Political parties need money and loans from abroad, and when in power, votes favorable press when in opposition. Jews threatened to cut off financing needed for election propaganda of various political parties, threatened with the cooperation of Jewish international finance to turn down loans to the government, threatened to control a large mass of votes through which, now that they had civil rights, they might decide victory or defeat through the democratic system. They threatened to manipulate the press, which they control almost entirely and without whose support a political party or government can be defeated. Money, press, and votes determine life and death in a democracy. The Jews control all of them, and through these the Romanian political parties turned into simple tools in the hands of the Judaic power. So that we who had begun fighting the Jews find ourselves all at once fighting the government, political parties, local authorities, the army, while the Jews sit quietly on the side. Now we're on the next section, Jewish arguments and attitudes. Starts with a quote here. What will foreign countries say of the Romanian anti-Semitic movement which takes us back to barbarism? What will men of science civilization say? Unquote. Our politicians will repeat to us at every step this Jewish argument printed daily in all newspapers, when finally after 8 years, Germany, notwithstanding all her civilization and culture, rises up against Jewry and defeats the Hydra through Adolf Hitler. That argument is dropped. Then they bring forth another, quote, you are in Germany's service, paid by the Germans to engage in anti-Semitism. Where do you get the funds? Unquote. And again, Romanian politicians, characterless, honorless, mimic the tune of Jewish press. Quote, whence the money? You are in Germany's pay. Unquote. In 1919, 1920, 1921, the entire Jewish press was assaulting the Romanian state, unleashing disorder everywhere, urging violence against the regime, the form of government, the church, Romanian order, national idea, patriotism. Now, as if by a miracle, the same press, controlled by the same men, changed into a defender of the state's order of laws, declares itself against violence, while we become the country's enemies, extremists of the right, in the pay and service of Romanianism's enemies, etc., and in the end, we will hear also this, that we are financed by the Jews. I wonder when will that day come, when every Romanian will understand the lies and perfidious argumentations of the Jews and reject them as something of satanic origin. I wonder, when will that moment come in which they comprehend the perversity of this race? Here is how 3 Romanian university professors, A.C. Cuza, Polescu, and Sumulianu, were treated in the Israelite Courier, official organ of the Union of Naturalized Jews of April 23, 1922, in the editorial titled The Ghosts. Quote, "A clique of clowns and public offenders got together to set up a band of wrongdoers, and to this country's shame among them one finds 3 professors of our universities. And these specimens, these belated ghosts want to revive anti-Semitism, and some retrograde clowns will succeed in this now, when official anti-Semitism is vanishing and the universal vote will also inevitably bring along a democratization of our public and social life. No, it is in vain they work. These ghosts are not going to halt mankind in its onward march, nor will it be necessary to pierce their hearts with a sharp pole. The ridiculousness of their treachery will definitively finish them. We have reported earlier the savage action originated by the so-called National Christian Union in order to fix them once and for all in their infamous posture and call it to the attention of the Jews that there are still wrongdoers around, against whom they should defend themselves." Unquote. So then, clique of clowns, public offenders, band of wrongdoers, specimens, belated ghosts, treachery, savage action, infamous posture, this is what Professor Cuza, Polescu, and Sumuliano, teachers of Romanianism, are, and what their action to save the nation is. So, let's continue here. "We have taken outrage after outrage, ridicule after ridicule, slap after slap, until we have come to see ourselves in this frightening situation. Jews are considered as defenders of Romanianism, sheltered from any unpleasantness, leading a life of peace and plenty, while we are considered enemies of our nation, with our liberty and life endangered and hunted down like rabid dogs by all the Romanian authorities. I witnessed with my own eyes these times and lived through them, and I was saddened to the depths of my soul. It is dreadful to fight for years on end for your fatherland, your heart as pure as tears, while enduring misery and hunger, then find yourself suddenly declared an enemy of your country, persecuted by your own kind, told that you fight because you are in pay of foreigners, and see the entire Jewry master over your land, assuming the role of the defender of Romanianism and caretaker of the Romanian state, menaced by you, the youth of the country. Night after night we were troubled by these thoughts, occasionally feeling disgusted and immensely ashamed, and we were seized by sadness. Would it not be better for us, we reflected, to go out into the world? Or would it not be more suitable to seek vengeance whereby all of us would perish, both we and the Romanian traitors as well as the heads of the Judaic Hydra? And then this is the next section here. The Congress of the Student Movement's Leaders, IASI, August 22nd to 25th, 1923. In a limited committee in Bucharest, it was decided a first Congress of the leaders and delegates of the student movement be held following 1 year of struggle. This Congress was to take place in Cluj on August 22nd and 25th, 1923. Moda, the president of the Petru Mayor Student Center, wrote us that local authorities informed him that they were ordered to interdict this Congress. We, the Iasians, replied to Cluj as well as to the other centers that we would take on the responsibility for this Congress to be held in Iasi, even if the government wished to forbid it. Our offer was accepted, and we fulfilled our duty of making the arrangements for quartering of the 40 known delegates. On the morning of 22nd August, we went to the railway station to meet the delegation from Cluj, headed by Ion Moda, then one from Cernaudi, headed by Tudos Popescu and Carstianu, and the one from Bucharest, led by Napoleon Critu, Simionescu, and Repianu. At 10 o'clock, we headed in corpore for the cathedral to pray and have a requiem celebrated in memory of student war dead, one of whom was the former president of the Student Center, Captain Stefan Petrovici. But to our great it says Chagrin, I think it's chagrin, we found the gates of the old cathedral chained down and shut and guarded by gendarmes. Meantime, old Professor Gavonescu also arrived. Then, uncovering our heads, we kneeled in the middle of the street in front of the church, which not even the infidel Turks had closed to those wanting to pray. As the priest Stiubi happened to come by, seeing us kneeling, he approached us and read a few prayers. Then, bareheaded and silent and very saddened, we covered the distance to the university, walking down the middle of the street, with stares from the Jews being shot at us like arrows from their doorways and shop windows. The local authorities, flanked by numerous police forces expecting us on the university steps, informed us that the Ministry of Internal Affairs forbade the Congress. The prosecutor stopped and warned us to disperse. Irritated, I replied, quote, "Mr. Prosecutor, I know we live in a country ruled by laws. The Constitution guarantees us the right to meet, and you, sir, know better than I that a minister cannot abrogate these rights guaranteed us by the Constitution. Consequently, in the name of the law that not we but you disobey, we call upon you to step aside," unquote. Hardened by the sacrilege committed an hour earlier when the church's gates were chained and we were prevented from praying, being now faced by a second unjust and humiliating provocation, that of being prevented from entering our own home, the university, realizing these measures constituted a brazen lawlessness, we upturned everything in our path and after some fighting, forcibly occupied the university. The 13th Regiment, arriving a moment later, surrounded the university. We barricaded ourselves in, guarding all entrances, while outside each window we could see 3 soldiers posted, bayonets at the ready. The Congress opened in the auditorium of the School of Law at 12 noon, under a heavy atmosphere in this inauspicious situation. The delegates, pale with indignation, muted by the sorrow of what happened at the cathedral and here, felt throughout the deserted halls an air of profound sadness. Everybody was worried about a possible army assault on the university and of the inevitable consequences. We delivered no discourses. The Congress fathomed the seriousness of the situation and was apprehensive of grave repercussions. I was chosen as president for the first day. We began by denouncing the day's events. Several asked for the floor to protest. Then we began discussions regarding the movement. What attitude do we take as the new school year opens? Do we capitulate? Difficult. A whole year of struggle with no result. On the contrary, shamed, humiliated, beaten. Do we keep on? Again, difficult. Students are exhausted. They cannot carry on a second year of battle. Yet Moda, Tudós, Popescu, Simonescu, and myself plead for continuing our fight, plead for sacrifice, as nothing would come from capitulation but shame and humiliation. And it was impossible that out of sacrifice that something better would not bear fruit for our nation. By 8 o'clock it was dark. Outside in the town we heard commotion and noise. Constantin Pancu, the veteran fighter of 1919, surrounded by the students, remained outside. A large number of townspeople gathered at Tufli Kef and carrying torches tried to advance up the hill toward the university to bring us several sacks of bread. We all jumped to the windows to look out. The demonstrators broke the cordon at Tulfi Cafe and ran up the hill. A second cordon at Orju Street was also broken in a tough fight. We heard outbursts of hurrahs. Likewise, a third cordon was overcome. We got ready to make an assault from the inside to get out, but our people on the outside could not break through the fourth cordon. One could hear Panku's voice, his sack of bread at his feet. Quote, "They are our children," unquote. We were crying tears of joy. It is for this people we fight, and it would not let us down. At 9 o'clock, negotiations began between us and the authorities through Napoleon Cretu. All the students were promised immediate freedom, provided I be turned into them. The students refused. At about 11, they sent word to us we could leave in groups of 3, naturally intending to apprehend me as we left. We accepted. Every minute a group of 3 left. At the door they were closely scrutinized by 4 commissars and agents. I quickly took off my national costume, gave it to a comrade, and donned his clothes. I left with Simonescu and a 3rd student. As the door swung open, I dropped some coins out of my pocket. As they hit the pavement, all commissars looked downward and asked, quote, "What did you lose, gentlemen?" Unquote. We, our heads also bent looking for coins, answered, quote, "Some change," unquote. Simonescu lingered behind, talking with them, searching for money by striking matches, while I escaped. We fixed a continuation of our Congress for the second day outside of town at the Keratuia monastery in the greatest secrecy. I sneaked up there disguised as a locomotive stoker and was lucky enough to be unrecognized even by the delegates. Ion Moda presided. With our sentries placed in strategic positions, we could detect anyone's approach a mile away. We worked in quiet and stayed there until late that day. Propositions were made, decisions taken. It was also at this meeting that December 10 was proclaimed a national holiday for Romanian students. On the third day, deliberations continued in a small forest on the Galata Hill. By a majority, it was decided to continue to strike. An action committee of 5 was elected to direct the actions of the entire student movement in all universities. The committee members were Ion Moda in Cluj, Tudos Popescu in Cernaudi, Eli Garnida in Iasi, Simonescu in Bucharest, and myself. By forming this committee, the old student leadership in Bucharest, insufficiently informed and indecisive, fell for good. It continued in the name, but no longer led. It was the first time it was officially decided to give the movement a new orientation. On one hand, to fight the political parties considered by us to be estranged from our nation, and on the other to strengthen the faith in a new Romanian movement, which must be officially helped by the students to attain victory. The League of the Christian National Defense. The Congress concluded its work on the fourth day in the house of Mrs. Jica on Carroll Street. In the evening, everyone left for his university, and I left for Câmpul Lung to organize the LANC Congress in Bucovina, in which Professor Cuza and all leaders of the movement were to participate. I had a hard time getting there, for an arrest warrant had been issued for me. As I was traveling, I rejoiced over all the decisions made by the Congress, which were in the spirit of our views, but especially because we gained for our side a man, Ion Moda, the president of the Petru Mayor Center in Cluj. And now we're on the next section here, the LANC's Congress at Câmpul Lung. The Congress at Câmpul Lung took place on Monday, September 17, 1923. We held it only after a tough battle because the government had forbidden it, and to enforce its edict sent in troops from Cernaudi under the command of a colonel. Strong troop cordons were set up at each entrance to the town. We concentrated all our forces at the west entrance in the town from Sadova Pojorada. There we broke cordons thanks to the archers from Vatra Dorni and Codreanu, giving us a whole hour to get the entire convoy of several hundred wagons through. The Congress convened in the town's churchyard. The speakers were Professor Cuza, my father, Dr. Catalin, LANC's president for Bucovina, Tudos Popescu, then brothers Octave and Valerian, Danielino, who enthusiastically had organized this imposing Congress with the help of Dr. Catalin. These proud mountain peasants with their long locks, dressed in white shirts and thick woven coats upon hearing the sound of the long mountain horn, gathered in their town, many in number and stormy as never before. They thought the hour had struck, awaiting for centuries for the Romanian to trample underfoot the hydra that had been sucking him dry, and that he emerged to assume his rights as master of his country, his mountains, his rivers, and his towns. They carried the burden of the war. Their sacrifice of blood on all fronts created Greater Romania. But to their great chagrin and disappointment, Greater Romania did not meet their expectations, because Greater Romania refused to break the chains of Jewish enslavement that had been torturing them for so long. Greater Romania abandoned them to further Jewish exploitation and brought down upon their heads the whiplashes of politicians who would send them into prisons when they tried to reclaim their stolen historical rights. All forests in Bucovina, all those mountains laden with furs belonging to the Orthodox Church, which was now infused with politics and estranged, were given to the Jew Anhuh, A-N-H-U-H, for exploitation of the firewood at the unheard-of price of 10 lei per cubic yard, and lei is like a Romanian monetary unit, while the Romanian peasant had to pay 350 lei. The mountain forests fall under the merciless Jewish axe. Poverty and sorrow spreads over the Romanian villages, mountains become barren rock, while Anhuh and his kin carry constantly and tirelessly their golden-laden coffers over the border. The partner in crime of the Jew in exploiting the misery of thousands of peasants was the Romanian politician who gorged himself on his portion of this fabulous profit. The rally delegated 30 leading peasants to go to Bucharest under the leadership of Dr. Catalin and Valer Danielino, see the Prime Minister, and ask him to take steps against the devastation of their mountains by revoking the Anhuh Church contract and to thus show their love for and gratitude to the young people who had aroused them to battle, beg him to put numerus clausus in the schools. Tudus Popescu and I were chosen to rally to accompany the 30 peasants to Bucharest. I left for Bucharest ahead of them in order to see that these peasants who came to the capital of their country for the first time were well received by the students. These peasants were approaching Bucharest with such purity of heart, with so much pain and so much expectations to plead our cause as well as theirs. The expense of their trip was disproportionately great compared to their poor means. Upon their arrival in Bucharest, the students received them royally, these kings of all times of the Romanian people, and they got off the train in their sacred capital with eyes full of tears. But behind the railway station, there waited Prosecutor Rascaunu, police commissioners and cordons of gendarmes that prevented their going through. The gendarmes and police commissars were then ordered to strike us. Rifle butts and sticks rained blows upon the white heads of peasants and on their serene faces. The furious students, then placing the old peasants in the middle of their group, charged and broke the first cordon, hastening toward the Polytechnical School, where they broke the second one, then a third, and escaped into Matashi Maserlu Square. The peasants wept. One of them, seized by uncontrollable indignation, tore his shirt. Next day, we all went to Gogu Cantacuzino Street, to the ministerial presidency, to be received by the Prime Minister. We were put off till the next day. Finally, we were told we would be received on the third day. We came. We entered a hall and waited about an hour, quietly talking in whispers and walking tiptoe. The officer-chief showed up. Quote, "Gentlemen, go home. The Prime Minister cannot receive you. He is entering the Council of Ministers," unquote. And then this is followed by another quote. "But we came from afar," unquote, we tried to say. The door was closed in our faces. I was thinking each man spent 1,000 lei on his fare alone. Shall we go back home not accomplishing anything? They can stay in Bucharest no longer. I grabbed the door with both hands and began to shake it with all my might, shouting at the top of my voice, quote, "Let us in, or else I'll break down the door and enter forcibly," unquote. I kicked at the door with my foot. The peasants raised a clamor and put their shoulders to the door. The door opened, and about 10 frightened individuals appeared, their hair on end, their faces yellow. I think they were newspaper men. Quote, "What is it you want, gentlemen?" unquote, they asked. Quote, "Tell the Prime Minister if he does not let us in, we'll break everything here and force our way in," unquote. Several minutes later, the doors were opened wide before us, and we entered. We climbed a flight of stairs. There in a hall, standing tall and straight as a pole, stood Ion Bratianu. Behind him, ministers Angelescu, Florescu, Constantinescu, Vintila Bratianu, and others. Quote, "What do you want, good men?" unquote, he asked. The two of us young students were still full of indignation, and we would have liked to appear fiercer, thus imparting the true note of the group's state of spirit. But the peasants, having trod with their country shoes on marble stairs and plush carpets, softened up. Quote, "Your Highness, Sir Prime Minister, we kiss your hands and keep ourselves respectfully at your feet. What do we want? We want justice, for the Jews have invaded us. They take out our timber by the hundreds of train flat cars while it rains in our homes. There are leaks in the roof, for we lack shingles with which to cover them. We cannot keep our children in schools any longer. The Jews also filled our schools, and our children will become their hired hands," unquote. Then other peasants spoke. Ion Bratianu listened, made no mention of our ruckus in the antechamber, and finally, after the peasants added, quote, "We also ask for the university students, our children, that numerus clausus be implemented as they have requested," unquote. He responded, quote, "Go home and have patience, because I will have the forest question looked into. As regards numerus clausus, it cannot be done. Show me but one single state in Europe that introduced this measure, and I, too, will introduce it," unquote. But Europe would wake up only 10 years later and introduce numerus clausus, thus recognizing our just cause. However, Ionel Bratianu would not live long enough to keep his promise, and his successors would be only low-level servants of Judaism who would raise their fists to strike us and kill us on order of their alien masters. We all left holding no hope. Nothing is going to be done. As an immediate consequence of the audience, several hours later, Dr. Catalin, who headed the delegation, and Valer Danielianu were arrested. A group of students that evening staged a hostile demonstration before the house of the Minister of the Interior. The student Vladimir Frimu was arrested and incarcerated in the Bucharesti prison. The rest of us then left for Kampul Lung. Now we're on the next section, the October 1923 student plot, an attempt at revenge to serve as an example to future generations. Moda also came to Kampul Lung to join me in going to Petru Rar's hermitage on the Raru mountain, the mountain I particularly love. So I think Petru Rars was a ruler of Moldavia from around the time period of the early 1500s to around the mid-1500s. As we climbed it, Moda shared with me his inner turmoil. Quote, students can no longer carry on next fall, and rather than all of us accepting shameful capitulation following a year of struggle, it would be better to urge them to resume classes, and we, who have led them, end the movement nobly by sacrificing ourselves and taking down with us all those we find most guilty of having betrayed the Romanian interests. Let us procure handguns and fire on them, giving a terrifying example to be long remembered throughout Romanian history. What will become of us after that, whether we shall die or whether we shall spend the rest of our days in prison, would no longer matter." Unquote. I agree that the final act of our fight be, at the price of our downfall, an act of punishment for the pygmies who, deserting the posts of great responsibility they were holding, humiliated and exposed the Romanian nation to untold dangers. We felt in that moment bubbling in our veins the blood which demanded vengeance for all the injustices and the long chain of humiliations to which our people have been subjected. Shortly after this, there gathered at Mr. Butnaru's home on 12 Savescu Street, Ion Moda, Corneliu Codreanu and Vernicescu from Cluj, Ili Garnidia, Radu Miranovici, Leonida Bandek, and myself from Iasi, and Tudos Popescu from Cernaudi. The first problem we had to face was to decide who were the principal guilty parties, who were the most responsible for the state of misery which seized the whole country, Romanians or Jews. We unanimously agreed that the first and greatest culprits were the treacherous Romanians who, for Judas's silver pieces, betrayed their people. The Jews are our enemies, and as such they hate, poison, and exterminate us. Romanian leaders who cross into their camp are worse than enemies. They are traitors. The first and fiercest punishment ought to fall first on the traitor, second on the enemy. If I had but one bullet and I were faced by both an enemy and a traitor, I would let the traitor have it. We agreed on the names of several individuals who had betrayed their country, namely 6 cabinet ministers, George Marzescu heading the list. At last the hour was striking for those scoundrels who never imagined they would have to account for their deeds in a country in which they consider themselves the absolute masters over a people incapable of any reaction, the hour in which they would have to answer with their lives. This time the nation was sending its avengers through the invisible ties of the soul. Then we took up the second category, the Jews. Which one shall we choose from the 2 million? We pondered, discussed, and finally concluded that the real chiefs of the Judaic attack on Romania are the rabbis. All rabbis in all market towns and cities. They lead the entire Jewish mass to attack, and wherever a Romanian falls, he does not fall by chance. He falls because he was marked by a rabbi. Behind every politician who sold out, there is the brains of a rabbi who laid the groundwork in order to Kahal, or the Jewish banker, to close the deal and pay him off. Behind every Jewish newspaper, to inspire slander, lies, instigation, there is a rabbi. But there are only a few of us, so we chose only the big cats in Bucharest. Had we had the numerical strength, we would have taken absolutely all of them. Then we picked the bankers, Aristide and Maritu Blank, who corrupted all parties and all Romanian politicians by putting them on boards of directors and showering them with money. Bercovici, who financed the Liberal Party. Then we looked over the Jews of the press, the most insolent ones, the poisoners of souls, Rosenthal, Filderman, Honningbmen, directors of the paper The Morning, The Truth, The Fight, all these enemies of Romanianism. We left for Bucharest in groups, saying to Iasi goodbye forever. I left a letter for the students in which I explained the justification for our gesture, bade them farewell, and urged them to go back to classes, but fully to keep the faith till final victory. We all wrote to our parents and comrades in arms. In Bucharest we met again at Danulescu's house. We had known him for some time now, and he had made a good impression on us. He was not included in this team, but he gladly put us up. We left this place that evening at 8 o'clock to go to Drago's at 41 13th of this September Street, where we were to clarify details and determine where our action should begin. We were hardly gathered together when a pale Dragos came into the room, saying, quote, "Brothers, the police have surrounded the house," unquote. This was on the evening of October 8, 1923, at about 9 o'clock, a moment of confusion on which we had no time to even talk. We just directed our searching looks to one another. Then I stepped out into the foyer where I could see the figure of General Nicolianu and his commissars who were forcing the door. The second the door gave way and the house was filled by commissars, General Nicolianu shouted, quote, "Hands up," unquote. We had no time, as we were each grabbed by two commissars and placed in line, myself in the right flank, then Moda, Corneliu Georgescu, Tudor Popescu, Radu Mironovici, Verniescu, Dragos, quote, "Turn over your revolvers," unquote. Followed by another quote, "We do not have any," unquote, we answered. Only Moda had a Browning 6.35 and a Verniescu. Then they took us out of the house, one at a time, each with his arms gripped by two commissars, and put us individually into waiting cars. Behind us in the house, Drago's old mother was crying. The cars started. Where were they taking us, we wondered. We did not utter one word. We asked no questions of those who held us prisoner, who, themselves, also kept silent. After riding through a few streets, we reached police headquarters. They had us get out and go into a room where they searched our pockets. They took everything we had on us away, including collar and tie. This frisking, this stripping of our collars, this treatment as if we were pickpockets was most humiliating. We were only at the beginning of this road of humiliation. With faces to the wall, not allowed to turn our heads, and kept in this position for some time, we were thinking, quote, "Free men several hours earlier, proud and determined to break the chains of our people. Look what we have become, some poor, powerless, unfortunate, stiffly facing a wall by orders of some miserable police agents, frisked like robbers, stripped of our personal effects," unquote. It was with this humiliation that our great suffering began, which little by little would rent our hearts. Our hearts. I think there is no greater suffering for a fighter who lives in dignity and honor than being disarmed, than humiliated. Death is always sweeter than this. Next we were taken to a room and seated 5 yards apart on benches, with the agents at our side, being forbidden to look at one another. We sat there like that for hours until we were called for interrogation. Sharers in these long, burdensome hours were, besides myself, Moda, Tudor Popescu, Radu Mironovici, Corneliu, Georgescu, Verniescu, and Dragos. After a while, one by one, we were called to be questioned in a larger room with the prosecutor, the investigating judge, General Nicolianu, and some government representatives there. My turn came toward morning. There they placed before me some of my letters in two baskets containing all our revolvers that were hidden in a supposedly quite safe place. I could not figure out how they got there. I could understand we were caught, but who told where the handguns were hidden? My questioning began. I had no idea what the others had declared, and we had no previous understanding among ourselves as to what to declare, for we had not dreamed we would find ourselves in such a predicament. This is why I weighed the situation and took the decision I considered best, a minute at the crossroads. When the first question was put to me, though 3 minutes had elapsed since coming into the room, I had not yet sized up the situation enough to take a decision. I felt overwhelmed by weariness and was profoundly shaken, and when I was asked to reply, I said, quote, "Gentlemen, please grant me a minute of reflection before I reply," unquote. The question was, to deny or not to deny. In that minute I strained all the powers of my mind and soul and decided to deny nothing, to tell the truth, and not timidly or remorsefully, but courageously. Quote, "Yes, these handguns are ours. We wanted to shoot with them the ministers, rabbis, and the big Jewish bankers," unquote. They asked me for their names, and when I started giving them their names, beginning with Alexandru Constantinescu and ending with the Jews Blank, Filderman, Berkovici, Honigman, and all those present stared Google-eyed, more and more terrified. From this I suspect that the comrades questioned before me had denied everything. Quote, "But why kill them?" unquote. Codreanu replied with, quote, "The former because they betrayed their country, the latter as enemies and corruptors," unquote. Quote, "Do you not regret it now?" unquote. Quote, "No, we regret nothing. Though we have fallen, it does not matter. Behind us there are tens of thousands who think likewise," unquote. Saying this, I have felt free from the boulder of humility under which I would have further sank, had I denied everything. Now I was standing on my fate that brought me here, proudly facing both my fate and those who seemed to hold the right of life or death over me. Had I denied everything, I would have had to stay on the defensive against the accusation lodged against me. Begging indulgence, gaining the goodwill of my inquisitors, at the trial to follow, and on the basis of written proof in their possession, we would have had to experience a painful and shameful test, denying our own writing and our own beliefs, denying the truth which went counter to our conscience and the honor of our movement. Representatives of a great student movement, should we lack the courage of taking responsibility for our deeds and faith? In this case, the country and our comrades on the outside would not have listened to our intentions, whereas only the fruit of our suffering, no matter how long it might be, was exactly that the country should be enlightened, so it could at least know its enemies better. They demanded I put these declarations down on paper in my own handwriting. I did so. In the end I added, quote, "The date had not been decided upon. They caught us while discussing this. I proposed to move in 1 or 2 weeks," unquote. At which the interrogator stopped me, insisting more and more that I not put down these particulars. It was only later that I realized there were reasons for this insistence, because my last phrase blew the juridical value of the entire accusation, being our defense point for a conspiracy demands 4 elements. 1, an association of individuals with one aim in mind. 2, the designation of crimes. 3, the acquisition of weapons. 4, a date established for the action. But since we had not yet decided upon a date for putting the plan into action, we were still in the discussion phase. The fixing of the date was of capital importance, for in 2 weeks we could have gotten ill. The victims could have died, the government could have fallen or given in, etc. Our entire juridical defense rested on this point. Following my testimony, agents led me into a cellar where I was placed in a cell alone. The door was padlocked on the outside. I guess my comrades were occupying the adjoining cells. I beat on the wall with my fist, asking who else was there. I received an answer, "Moda." I then laid down on the boards to get some sleep, for I was dead tired, but not having a heavy coat, I trembled from the cold. Then lice began biting me. They swarmed over me by the thousands. I turned the boards on the other side. The lice came on top. I repeated this operation several times until I thought it must be daylight. I heard a noise at the door. It was open, and those of the others, and we were all taken out, then placed in cars, each accompanied by 2 gendarmes and 2 commissars. The cars then left one after the other, and the same question crossed our minds. Where to? And now we're at the next section of this chapter, in the Vaccaresti prison. We passed through several unfamiliar streets on which the curious passersby stared at us. We left the capital behind, and the cars stopped in front of some large gates, above which was written, quote, "The Vaccaresti prison," unquote. We got out of the cars, flanked by soldiers with bayonets, spaced 10 yards apart. A creaking of locks and chains was heard, and the big gates were opened. One by one we crossed ourselves, and stepping inside, were led upstairs to the prison offices where our arrest warrants were handed to us. We realized we were arrested for conspiracy against state security, with forced labor as the specified punishment. We were then taken to another yard, in the middle of which rose a tall church. All around there were walls, and along them cells. I put into a cell way back, 1 yard wide, 2 deep. Then it was locked on the outside. There was only one plank bed inside, and near the door a small iron-grilled window. I wondered where my comrades were. Then I laid my head on the boards and fell asleep. I woke up after 2 hours shaking. It was cold, and no sun's ray penetrated into the cell. Dazedly, I looked around me and could hardly believe where I was. I looked well and saw the misery of the cell. I told myself, difficult situation. A wave of pain ripped my heart, but I consoled myself. It is for our people. Then I began gymnastic movements with my arms to warm myself up. At around 11 o'clock I heard footsteps. A guard opened the door. I looked at him. Perhaps I had met him at some time, I'd hoped, but he was a stranger, a surly man. He looked at me with mean eyes. He gave me a loaf of bread and a dish of borscht. I asked him, quote, "Mr. Guard, might you happen to have a cigarette?" Unquote. The guard replied, quote, "No, I do not." Unquote. He locked me up again and left. I broke the black bread and swallowed a few spoonfuls of borscht. Then I placed them down on the cement floor and began to collect my thoughts. I could not comprehend how they discovered us. Could it be that one of us was careless enough to speak about our project to someone? Did someone betray us? How come they found our revolvers? Again I heard footsteps. I looked through the window. A priest and several men were nearing my cell. They said, quote, "Well, gentlemen, is it possible that you, educated youth, could do such a thing?" Unquote. Codreanu replies with, quote, "If it is possible for this Romanian people to perish invaded by Jewry and by being overwhelmed by the sellout, licentiousness, and ridicule of its leaders, then what we did is possible too." Unquote. Quote, "But you have so many legal means." Unquote. And Codreanu responds with, quote, "We have gone by way of all the legal paths till this time. If just one had been open to us, it may be we would not have landed in these cells." Unquote. Quote, "And now is it good? You will have to suffer for your deeds." Unquote. Codreanu responds, quote, "Perhaps from our suffering something better will emerge for this people." Unquote. They left. At about 4 o'clock, a guard came bringing me a worn-out blanket and a large sack full of straw in lieu of a mattress. I evened up the sack as well as I could. Then I ate a little more bread and lay down. I was meditating on a discussion I had had with the priest, and I was thinking, quote, "A people never gained anything out of the partying and easy living of its sons. It was always the suffering that resulted in the good gains for it." Unquote. I succeeded in finding a purpose for our suffering and at the same time some moral support for these sad hours. Then I got up, knelt, and prayed, quote, "Lord, we take upon ourselves all the sins of this nation. Receive this our suffering now. See that a better day for this people be forthcoming through this suffering." Unquote. Then I was thinking about my mother and those at home who may have heard of my fate and might be thinking of me. I prayed for them and I lay down to sleep. Although I was dressed and covered with the blanket, I was cold, and I slept poorly on that straw mattress. I was awakened at 8 o'clock when a guard opened the door and asked me if I wanted to go out for several minutes. I got out and did some gymnastics to warm up. The row of cells, of which mine was one, was somewhat higher than the rest, so I could see the entire courtyard. All at once I saw someone wearing national dress walking around the inmates. It was my father, but I could not believe it. What was he doing here? Was he also arrested? I made a few signs and he saw me. The guard stopped me. Quote, "Mister, you are not allowed to signal." Unquote. Codreanu responds, quote, "He is my father." Unquote. I answered, quote, "That may be, but you are not allowed to signal." Unquote. I looked at him and said, quote, "Comrade, leave us alone in God's care with the suffering he gave us. Don't you add more to it." Unquote. And I went back into my cell. After lunch, they took me out again. They flanked me between bayonets and led me out of the prison, where on the road, all of us were placed in a single file at 10 yards apart, each between 2 bayonets. My father was leading the column between 2 soldiers, bayonets at the ready. There were some new arrestees: Traian Brizon from Cluj, Leonida Bandic from Iasi, and Danulescu. We were not permitted to turn our heads or to signal one another. For just a second I got a glimpse of the sunken faces of my poor comrades in suffering. What gnawed at my heart was the injustice to which my father was being subjected. He was guilty of nothing, a lifetime fighter for this nation, a professor in secondary schools, a major, former battalion commander on the front line all during the war, several times a member of parliament, and not an obscure one at that. He was now paraded on the streets of Bucharest between bayonets. We left thus in a column trudging towards the tribunal. Romanians looked at us with indifference. When we reached the Jewish quarter, all the Jews came out to doors and windows. Some threw at us outrageous looks and laughed. Others commented loudly. Others spat. We bent our heads and walked thus the whole way, our hearts full of pain. At the tribunal, our arrest warrants were confirmed. We were defended by the attorney Paul Ilescu, who was the first lawyer to offer to plead our case. We were then sent back in the same formation on the same route. We could see on newsstands the headlines of The Morning and other Jewish newspapers. Quote, "Student conspiracy, the arrest of the plotters," unquote. And again I got to my cell. For 2 weeks I stayed there in the cold, with no further knowledge of the others or any news from outside. After 2 weeks seeming like 2 centuries, we were taken out of our cells and placed in heated rooms in threes. We were permitted to cook and eat together. When we saw each other again, it was like a true holiday. I was to share a room with Dragos and Danulescu. Meantime, Garnita, the president of the Association of Christian Students, turned himself in so that our numbers grew to 13. My father, free of any guilt, Moda, Garnita, Tudos, Popescu, Corneliu Codreanu, Radu Mironvisi, Leonida Bandic, Verniescu, Traian Briezu, and myself charged with conspiracy. Dragos and Danulescu detained for having sheltered us. In addition to these, there was Vladimir Frimu, who had been arrested when we demonstrated in front of the Minister of Interior's home. We obtained a Primus stove on which we cooked the groceries sent from the outside by relatives and friends. The regular prison food was something frightful, and the mystery in which the inmates lived, indescribable. My father got permission from the prison administration for us to go each morning at 7 o'clock into the church in the courtyard to pray. We all knelt before the altar saying the Our Father, and Tudos Popescu sang Pria Sefana Nascatore de Numesu, which translates to Most Blessed Virgin Mary. There we found our solace for our sad prison life and hope for tomorrow. Each of us set up a work schedule for himself. Moda busied himself with the matters related to the forthcoming trial. Danulescu studied for exams in medicine. I was working on plans for the organizing of the youth in the national struggle, organizing the student centers, the youth in villages, and the students in secondary schools. I worked this out down to the smallest detail till Christmas time, so that if we got out of prison, we could put it into practice. If not, we decided to find someone on the outside to implement it. This was to be done within the framework of the League, which was to be the political arm, while our section would be for educating the youth and for fighting. On November 8th, the feast of Saints Archangels Michael and Gabriel, we were discussing the possible name for this youth organization. I said, quote, "Let it be Michael the Archangel," unquote. My father said, quote, "There is in the church on the left-hand door of the altar an icon of St. Michael," unquote. Quote, "Let us go see it," unquote. Moda, Garnita, Corneliu Codreanu, Radu Mironvisi, Tudos, and I went to look at it, and we were truly amazed. The icon appeared to us of unsurpassed beauty. I was never attracted by the beauty of any icon, but now I felt bound to this one with all my soul, and I had the feeling the Archangel was alive. Since then, I have come to love that icon. Any time we found the church open, we entered and prayed before that icon. Our hearts were filled with peace and joy. The torture of our trips to the tribunal was resumed. On foot between the bayonets through mud, with our worn-out shoes and our feet wet. Some Jewish crooks who defrauded the state of several 100 million lei were driven to the tribunal in cars while we walked. Many times our trips were made unnecessarily only to harass us. I was called to the tribunal 25 times, to be interrogated by the investigating judge only twice. We changed no part of our early dispositions. One thought preoccupied us constantly. Who betrayed us? Night after night we sought to solve this enigma. We reached a stage where we were suspicious of one another. One morning I went to church to pray before the icon to reveal us the traitor. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I spoke to my comrades, quote, I am compelled to bring you sad news. The betrayer has been identified. He is in our midst, sitting at the table with us, unquote. Everyone was looking at everyone else. Maud and I followed everyone's face, hoping for an indication. I put my hand in my breast pocket, saying, quote, now I will show you the proof, unquote. At that moment, Verniescu stood up, hesitated for an instant, gave Bandic the key to the food box, and said, quote, I am leaving, unquote. We were puzzled by his departure, but resumed our discussion regarding the proof I refused to produce, for I had none. When we left the table, we found Verniescu alone. He addressed us, quote, Codreanu suspects me, unquote. I told him I suspected no one. Thus we were reconciled. Weeks and weeks passed, and our prison life was dragging on. We marked in pencil on the wall every passing day. Life in prison was difficult, exhausting for the man who was born free, who lived in dignity. It was horrible to feel in chains within high, unfriendly walls, far from your loved ones, of whom you hear nothing. And not even here can you move around much. For 3/4 of the time we were kept locked in our cells. Every evening the sinister noise of bolts being drawn at your door plunged one into a mood of sadness. The enemies of this nation were free outside, enjoying respect and the good life, while we, in addition to moral indignities, oftentimes went to bed hungry and shivering from the cold the whole night on plank beds and straw. But finally, joyous days came our way. After 2 months of imprisonment, we received the news that the order for my father's and Danilescu's release has been received. For us, indeed, great joy. We had helped them pack, and shortly they were taken away. We watched as they left until they passed through the first gate. I asked my father to tell Mother and the others not to worry at all. Anyone's liberation is an occasion of great joy for those left behind. Everyone is glad. Perhaps by one's liberation each grows stronger in the hope of obtaining his own freedom. After a short while, Dragos, Bandic, Brezu, and Verniescu left, having been taken out of the case, as were my father and Danilescu. Only 6 of us were left and charged with conspiracy against state of security. Several days later, Dragos sent the news that it was Verniescu who betrayed us. He also made copies of the latter's testimony, which was on file. We received this news with hearts full of bitterness. Our nation had always had her share of traitors. Now we're on the next portion of this chapter titled Outside. In all universities, students returned to classes. It seemed there was a moment of disorientation. For 2 months they had been living under the terror of the Jewish press, which incessantly exaggerated the gravity of our attempt at revenge and its disastrous consequences for the country. It shouted that we had lost confidence of the civilized world, that we were a Balkan state. They constantly asked, quote, what will Berlin say? Vienna? Paris? Unquote. And so they transformed into defenders of the permanent interest of the state. Jews daily urged the country's leaders to take radical measures against the national movement, which must be suppressed, quote, with the utmost violence. A year earlier, when Max Goldstein planted the bomb in the Senate building and the police were rounding up communist Jews, the sane press was yelling, quote, a state cannot maintain itself against popular will by the use of violence. Where is the Constitution? Where are the laws? Where are the constitutionally guaranteed freedoms? What are foreign countries going to say when the state takes such restrictive steps? A state cannot survive through arrests, prisons, bayonets, terror. For this violence the state uses will be returned by the multitude or isolated individuals. Force will be answered by force, terror with terror, and they will not be guilty, but the state that provoked them, unquote. And now, with a shamelessness which only the blindfolded fail to see, the same press wrote, quote, it is not enough that these terrorists be arrested. They must be condemned in such a manner as to make them an example. Even this is not enough. All those who propagate such anti-Semitic ideas which cause so much damage to our country ought to be arrested. This anti-Semitic weed ought to be pulled out, root and all, and this question must be dealt with mercilessly and without clemency, unquote. To this torrent of hostility, the national press opposed a fierce resistance. In addition to the Universe, which always expressed a correct attitude regarding the manifestos of national conscience, the nationalist movement had the support of the following newspapers. The Student Voice, put out by the Bucharest students, which only recently came under the editorship of our indefatigable comrades who were free, Simonescu, Râpâneanu, Fanica, Anestiascu, Danulescu, and others whose names escape me. Nu Dacia, organ of the students in Cluj, directed by Suliaga, Mocanu, Iustin Ilescu, the poet and author of the students' hymn. The Word of Iasi, organ of the Iasi students. Awake Ye Romanian, organ of the Cernati students, recently moved to Campo Lung, directed by Dr. Catalin and Danielianu. The National Defense, official organ of the LANC, Bucharest, with the unsurpassed articles of Professor Paulescu, from which we produced the following lines, quote, "The same constraint through cold, hunger, and terror successfully used by Bolshevik Jews was used on the students. Who could ever imagine that the time would come when our children, the flower of the Romanian nation, would be compelled to celebrate the holiday of the unification of all Romanians locked up in the cellars of some prison or chased into the cold without shelter, without food? Probably you did not realize that you were waging war against the entire Romanian nation." Unquote. And he's listing more publications here, pro-Romanian publications. The Union, organ of the LANC, IASI, directed by Professor Cuza, containing articles of immortal logic. The Nationalist, popular organ of the League in IASI. Freedom, popular newspaper in Oriasti, belonging to Father Morda, who revealed our gesture in its true light, being thus the first to unhesitatingly cut the entire curtain of silence that surrounded us those very first moments. The student body understood our sacrifice. That is why the student movement rallied more and more around these walls of the Vacaresti prison, in which each student center had its imprisoned representatives. Peasants, too, began showing concern in our lot. They sent us money, had masses said for us in churches, particularly in Bukovina's mountains in Transylvania, where freedom penetrated. Here is a small example. The might of the Modi for the students in Vacaresti. Quote, "Among the gifts of money received by the students locked up in Vacaresti prison from the peasants from all regions, there is one more brilliant and more precious than all the others. It is that sent by the Modi of the Apusini mountains. Scraping the bottom of their leather belt pockets or a corner of their kerchiefs, they gathered their 2, 3, or 5 li to send down their valleys on path trod by Iancu, their defender of old, and sent them along with their hearts over the long, long way to Vacaresti across the mountains, where they had heard their sons were imprisoned for wanting to save them from want and injustice, from poverty and chagrin. These contributions were sent from the poorest corner of our country, of which the song says, with so much bitterness and sorrow, 'Gold lies in our mountain's core, while we beg from door to door.' The most precious gift was sent to the students in Vacaresti, a handful of change and a fragment of a beggar's soul, hungry and naked without lodging, a soul that hides beneath the rag, its greatest treasure, moral health, that inexhaustible source of strength from which, in times of great tribulation, springs the salvation of the people. The Modi think of the students. Their soul began to understand, to stir, to forge a new ideal. This is the best and most eloquent sign. Listen to some of their names from the town of Risca, near Baia de Cris. Nicolae Opera, 2 lei. Nicolae Floria, 3 lei. And it just keeps going on and on and on. Just members of the parish stating how much money they're giving to the students. And it gets consecutively larger. The peasants will soon understand and will come to our side with their strong and long-enduring soul in the expectation of the hour of justice." Unquote. Now we're on a new section here, Thoughts of a New Life. Christmas holidays here, there in Vacaresti prison, we thought constantly of our families back home, and especially during the long, sleepless nights, or relentlessly worried. When will our side win, we wondered. When will we get out of here? If we are sentenced to 10 to 15 years, Will we be able to weather the imprisonment, or will our suffering and worry sap our health day by day till we perish? We floated in the unknown. The state of uncertainty consumed us. We should have liked to have the trial date set once and for all in order to know sooner the fate awaiting us. The suffering and common fate we had in store bound us together more and more, and discussions over the innumerable questions raised led us to the same conclusion. Little by little, shaping uniform pattern of thinking, the smallest questions regarding the national movement preoccupied us for hours and days. There is where we learn to think deeply and pursue a problem in all of its ramifications, down to the finest detail. We resumed the study of the Jewish problem, its causes, its chances for solution. We established organization and action plans. After a while, discussions were finished, and we passed on to laws, to indisputable truths and axioms. We watched Romanians on the outside of our group gropingly delve into a national problem and giving birth either to a newspaper or a parody of an organization. We could see they were reaching false conclusions in a matter of doctrine, were uncertain in matters of organization, and totally lacked original ideas in matters of action. We realized then, even better as a result of more profound reflection, that 1. The Jewish problem is no utopia, but a grave life-and-death problem for the Romanian nation. The country's leaders, grouped by the political parties, becoming more and more like toys in the hands of the Judaic manipulators. 2. This present political system, through its concept of life, its immorality, and its democratic setup from which it springs, constitutes a real curse fallen upon the Romanian people. 3. The Romanian people will not be able to solve the Jewish problem unless it first solves the problem of its political parties. The first aim to be reached by the Romanian people on its way to topple the Judaic power that oppresses and strangles it will have to be the toppling of this political system. A country has only the Jews and the leaders it deserves. Just as mosquitoes can settle and thrive only in swamps, likewise the former can only thrive in the swamps of our Romanian sins. In other words, in order to win over them, we will have first to extirpate our own defects. The problem is even deeper than Professor Cusa had shown it to us to be. The mission of this fight had been entrusted to Romanian youth, which, if it wants to take up the challenge of this historical mission, if it wants to go on living, to continue having a country, must prepare and gather all of its forces to carry on the fight and win. We decided that when we should get out of prison by God's help, we not part ways, but stay united to dedicate our lives to this one aim. But before busying ourselves with other people's defects, we began by looking at our own sins. We held long meetings in which each of us told the defects he observed in the rest, and we endeavored to correct them. This was a delicate matter, for so is man made. He does not take lightly the critique of his own defects. Each believes or wants to show he is perfect. But we shall say first we should know and correct our sins, and then we shall see whether we have the right or not to engage in improving upon others. This is how the holidays passed, and then the winter. Spring arrived. We knew as yet nothing regarding our future faith, only that a great popular current in our favor was born on the outside, supporting our cause in spite of all desperate endeavors of the Jewish press to stem it. This current was steadily growing among students, townspeople, and peasants, uniformly strong in Transylvania, Bessarabia, Bukovina, and the Old Kingdom. Now we were receiving letters of support and encouragement from all parts. Spring finally brought us a great joy. Trial was set for March 29th before the Assizes Court of Ifalv. We began to get ready, but what kind of preparation could we make? We admitted everything. We said all we had to say. Lawyers who signed up to defend us came to visit us. They called to our attention the gravity of our position in view of our testimony, suggesting we change it as well as our whole attitude. That would be more prudent to deny. We categorically refused and asked them to defend us within the framework of our testimony, that we did not intend to alter it the least bit, no matter what might be the outcome of the trial. If by any chance we should be acquitted, how could we do without the icon before which we prayed each morning? We searched among all the inmates till we found a painter. We asked him to make us a copy, and in 3 weeks' time he made an exact replica, 6 feet high, and a small one for me to carry on my person, and a third of medium size for my mother. Moda also had one made for his parents. Then we figured that on the basis of our testimony we would most certainly receive at least 5 years, and we knelt before the icon, quote, "Lord Almighty, we consider these 5 years lost to ourselves. If we are acquitted, we pledge to consecrate them to the cause of our nation," unquote. We decided that all of us would move to Iyasi in case we were acquitted, there to establish our center of activities. From there, following the plans we had readied, we would begin organizing the country's entire youth, beginning with high school boys and girls and even younger students, those in the normal schools, trade schools, seminaries, commercial schools, and finally, youth in the villages. After that, the university centers would be reamped. All these young people, we hoped, would grow in the spirit of the faith that animated us, so that as young adults they would enter the political arena where the fate of our struggle was to be determined, and being further augmented by new graduates year after year would become like waves of assault endlessly coming on. Next portion of the chapter, the isolation of politicians. The political system has infected our national life. Organization of the youth is needed, as is also emphasis on the necessity for their further self-education, to protect and separate them from the infection of the political system. To permit the infection of the Romanian youth to continue means annihilation for us and a definitive victory for Israel. Moreover, our organizing of this youth will take care of the very problem of our political system, which by lack of young recruits will starve to death. The slogan of the entire younger generation must be, "No youth must ever enter the gate of a political party. He who does so is a traitor to his generation and his nation. For in effect, by his presence, name, money, work, he strains the power of the politicians. Such a one is a traitor, just as he is a traitor who leaves the side of his brothers and goes over into the camp of their enemy. Though he may not shoot back with a weapon, if he only carries water for those who do shoot, he is an accomplice to the killing of those falling among his betrayed comrades, consequently a traitor to his cause. The theory urging us to all join political parties in order to improve them, if we pretend they are bad, is false and perfidious. As it has been from the beginning of the world, day and night uninterruptedly, it is only sweet water that has flowed into the Black Sea from thousands of rivers, this never resulting in sweetening the sea's salty water, but rather the opposite. Likewise with us entering the cesspool of political parties, not only will we not better them, they will corrupt us. And I think this is very relevant with the, optics debate that occurred among the white nationalist movement after Charlottesville, in which there is the whole AMNAT-WIGNAT divide, in which the AMNATs, people like Weave and Douglas Mackey were proposing. Douglas Mackey was Ricky Vaughn, for those of you listening and don't know. They were proposing this idea that white nationalists need to accept the fact that the GOP is the party of implicit whiteness, because the majority of Republican voters are white, and that white nationalists need to covertly infiltrate it, become an intern, try to go up the echelons of the GOP power structure as much as possible, and then do this in secret, until the time is right. And they were denouncing anyone who was against this idea as like a Whigger nationalist or a Whignat. And, it was a very disingenuous debate from the side of the AMNATs, and the Whignats weren't, they were trying to frame the Whignats, including people like myself, as just all National Socialist Movement type of people with face tattoos and, wearing the swastika, and, they had to strawman a lot of our ideas because we try to make it very clear that, infiltrating the GOP is about as fruitful as trying to infiltrate a synagogue. It's not going to happen. It's funded by big Jewish Zionist donors that basically get to shape how it's going to be, and you can't really do much about it. And they have ways of sniffing people like you out. Like, they know you're not the first dude who's, had racial inclinations that's joined the GOP and has tried to shift the GOP towards a certain direction. They know you people exist. They've been, hunting you down since the 1960s. And it's only gotten worse over time. So, yeah, I found it to be a very, very good quote here. All right, continuing on. These were the thoughts and resolutions uppermost in our minds to implement when we would have been acquitted. Our organizational setup was ready, our plan of action established down to the minutest detail. Everybody's part was set. The newspaper that was to be put out was to be named Generatia Nua, or the New Generation, and our organization was, as a whole, was to be named the Archangel Michael. All our flags would have to carry the image of St. Michael the Archangel from the church in Bucharesti prison. This organization, as we saw it, the entire youth generation, was to be the youth section of the political organization LANC, having as its aim the education of this youth. For us, this program, conceived within the Bucharesti prison walls, was the beginning of a new life. It represented something complete in inspiration, organization, plan of action, different from anything else we had thought of earlier. It was the beginning of a new world, a foundation on which we could build for years to come. Upon leaving the prison, we were to go to all university centers and share with the students of our decisions, showing them that street demonstrations and clashes no longer have a raison d'être in view of our new plan. We would still cling to our past expressions, not denying them as ours, would not be ashamed of them. But their time is gone. We must all engage now in a great organizing task that will bring us to glory. Now we're on the next and I believe final section of this. Actually, no, not the final section, but second to last section here. We're on page 135 and this chapter ends at 138, so we're very close to done. But it's titled Avenging the Betrayal and the Trial. We saw Moda pensive. He was constantly telling us that once out, we would not be able to make any headway unless we punished a betrayer. It had always been betrayal that sapped the nation's strength, but we Romanians had never turned our weapons on the traitors. That is why treason took root and traitors multiplied in all walks of life. That is why Romanian public life was nothing now but a permanent betrayal of the people. If we did not solve this problem of treason, our work would be compromised. We were very excited the night before our trial began. At last our fate was to be decided. In the morning we were taken to the office for our families to see us. Corneliu Codreanu's parents were from the Poiana Sibiuli. Shortly, Verniescu came in. Moda took him by the arm as if he wanted to tell him something, and both went into a nearby room. Several minutes later, we heard 7 gunshots and shouts. We stepped out into the hall. Moda had shot Verniescu to punish him for his betrayal. I jumped to Moda's side to defend him, for he was surrounded by police officers and functionaries threatening him. When the commotion subsided, we were immediately taken away and put in separate cells. Through little windows, we could see Verniescu carried out of the infirmary on a stretcher on the way to the hospital. In our cells, we all began whistling Christian Students of Greater Romania, our fighting hymn to accompany him, thus till he disappeared through the prison gates. 2 hours later, the investigating judge, Papadopoulos, arrived. He had made us brought upstairs one by one to appear before him. We all made common cause with Moda. The next day, following a night spent sleeping on cement floors, we were taken to the tribunal. Our situation was now very grave, yet we, in the basement of the courthouse, sang our fighting songs the whole time. The trial was to begin at 1 o'clock. Since 10 o'clock, thousands of students and citizens had been gathering around the tribunal. At around noon, all the capital's regiments had been called up to control the crowds. At 1 o'clock, we were led into the court of assizes. Presiding was Mr. David Doglu, and prosecutor was Mr. Racoviciano. On the defense bench we sat Professor Paulescu, Paul Iliscu, Nelu Ionescu, Theodorescu, Donca Mania, Tanche Polycrat, Nalm, etc. After the jurors were drawn, the definitive writ was read amid great silence. We listened. We realized that our fate was being decided. Then it came our turn to speak. The interrogation began. We admitted everything with the exception of having reached a final decision. We did not determine our date, but we showed the motives pushing us into this action. We showed the menace of the Jewish problem and accused the politicians of corrupting and betraying the nation. In spite of many interruptions by the preceding officer, we continued our testimony to the end. There followed a severe and oftentimes unjust and insinuating indictment delivered by the prosecutor. We felt the balance tipping in his favor, but the prosecution's success was short-lived. Professor Paulescu read his declaration in the Churchlight's silence imposed by his great prestige and saintly figure. It was a short declaration, but for the prosecutor, who seemed to embarrassingly sink into his easy chair, a devastating one. A recess was taken. It was now 8 o'clock in the evening. Outside, the crowd waited in increasing numbers. Nelu Ionescu, Tace Polycrat, and others, and at the end Paul Iliscu, spoke brilliantly. It was 5 o'clock in the morning by this time. The prosecutor, through a new indictment, tried to regain his position and win over to court. Our lawyers answered him. At 6 o'clock we had our last word. Then we were taken out. The jurors began their deliberation. We waited over half an hour that seemed to us half a year. A little afterwards we heard hurrahs. An officer brought us the news, quote, "You are acquitted," unquote. We were then taken back into the courtroom where the acquittal verdict was read to us. Outside, people were still waiting. Upon learning we were acquitted, they broke into hurrahs and singing. We were loaded into a car which took us through unfamiliar streets back to Vakaresti for the completion of customary discharge formalities. We gathered up our belongings and icons, ready to leave that grave with its long nights of turmoil and its sufferings, but poor Moda had to stay on, who knew for how long, to suffer henceforth all alone. We took leave of him, we embraced him, tears in our eyes, and parted from him in profound pain. We left to be free. He entered his cell anew in solidarity. Oh, how many more weeks he would have to lie there alone on that cement. As soon as we were out, the first thing we did was go to Danulescu and Dragos to ask forgiveness of their families for the trouble we caused them and to thank them for their concern for us during our imprisonment. Then we left for our homes, where our mothers and the whole family expected us, rejoicing with eyes full of tears. Now we're at the final section of this chapter, at Iyasi. At Iyasi I was impatiently expected by the younger comrades. I no longer found any of my classmates there, since last fall they had all scattered to their own hometowns. I took my icon to St. Spiridon Church, where I placed it within the altar. One after another I met all my friends, and we rejoiced to see each other again. But our joy did not last long, for as I was promenading on Lepus Nanu Street with my two sisters, about 10 students, the police jumped on us out of the blue sky, striking us over the head with their rubber clubs and hitting us with their rifle butts. Provoked in this manner, and struck for no reason in the Iyasi in which we had seen so many battles, in the Iyasi in which we beat Judeo-Communism at the university in 1919, 1920, and 1922, in the Iyasi in which we put in their place and kept at bay for years the overwhelming Jewry and its press, struck in my own house. Then I turned to deliver our riposte. Indignation seemed to give me the strength of a lion, and I would have been able to take on the whole police force, but my students' friends grabbed hold of me, some my arms, some my legs. Held thus, I received several additional blows with rifle butts. Passer-by began booing the police and shouting. I left for home dejected, furious at those who held me, but they were telling me, quote, "They have orders to provoke you. If you retaliate, to shoot and get rid of you," unquote. In the afternoon, together with Garniata and Radu Miranovici, I went on a student dormitory where in a large room we gathered the student leaders. They told us how for 6 months, during which we did not see each other, they had fought, and how much they had taken, how they went back to classes, and how they handled the situation so as not to be humiliated. How on November 1st, on opening day, a religious service was held in the auditorium before all the students and professors, and what student Lazarescu said on the occasion, quote, "We will go back to classes, but not right away. First, we will address a memorandum to our professors and the University Senate, expecting a satisfactory reply," unquote. Then he related to us how this memorandum was presented and how university professors headed by Bakaluglu, the prorector, granted the greatest part of the memorandum's points. On November 6, the students resumed classes. The professors knew how to avoid an unjust humiliation of the students who fought a whole year for their beliefs. They went on telling us how Marzescu, the interior minister, brought his own man in as police prefect, giving him free rein to crush the student movement and national movement in Iasi. How this man, with the help of his entire police force, engaged in this work. Because the students went back to classes and quiet was reestablished, and at a loss as to how to win his laurels and get paid, he began to provoke them. They further related to us how on December 10th, the girl students headed for the cathedral were met by intoxicated people who beat them with their rubber truncheons, grabbed them by their hair right in view of the professors, and dragged them through mud on the street, how one by one the students were beaten, and how on December 10th, the student Georgi Manolio, the choir conductor, was beaten on his ankles with sticks, then arrested, how he, kept by the police in a state of great misery, contracted jaundice and died in the hospital. The students in Iasi went through tough times in those 6 months. We in our turn told them of our tribulations, reminding them that it was our duty to get Moda out of prison. In the end, we gave them an account of our plans for the future, how we must organize our entire generation, raise it and educate it in a heroic spirit, how we would have to isolate the political system so that no youth would ever enter its ranks, and how it could be defeated and the LANC with Professor Cuza could get in, how only through a nationalist government, the expression of our Romanian conscience, force, and health, could the Jewish problem be solved, by taking legal measures to protect the Romanian element and putting brakes on the Jewish invasion. How our generation has the great and sacred mission to revive this conscience, this force, and this vitality, that we, the Vakarestians, have described that all of us are to come to Iasi and establish here the center of this action, which we would place under the protection of St. Michael the Archangel. Our comrades listened and received our plans for the future with much joy. After the meeting, we paid our visits to Professor Cuza, Galvanescu, Sumulianu, etc., sharing our thoughts with them as well. And that's the end of this chapter. Technically 2 chapters, but the first chapter was literally like a handful of pages, so I decided to combine them together. I appreciate it for listening. I'll be posting the rest of these on VNN forums in the audiobook section. And I hope to have the next chapter out real soon. 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 Real soon.